She was 19 and homeless. No room, no job, no winter coat, just her grandmother's dye notebook and $6 she had folded into a grocery receipt after buying crackers for her mother's hospital tray. And with that $6, she bought a forgotten wool dyeing house outside Shelburne Falls in Franklin County, Massachusetts, a place that had fallen off county tax maps in 1997. The roof had opened over the north wall. The copper vats were green with weather and mouse dust. The county had condemned it since 1989 and was scheduled for demolition the following spring. But what nobody knew was that beneath the plank floor inside the mordant cellar, in a hidden compartment that had not been opened in over 70 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Della. Ruth Mercer had been waiting her whole life without knowing it. Not the kind of waiting that keeps a person still, though to strangers, she had often looked still. She had waited in laundromats while other families' shirts turned behind glass. She had waited beside clinic doors with a paper cup of water in one hand and her mother's prescription bag in the other. She had waited outside offices where women in clean shoes looked down at forms and said they would call when something opened. But long before the hospitals and the eviction notice, there had been other forms of waiting. She had waited for colour. As a child, Della knew that yellow did not arrive all at once. It came slowly from onion skins, if they were saved in a brown bag and not thrown away. It came from goldenrod gathered before rain, from weld simmered low enough not to bruise its brightness, from the patience of heat held under boiling. Red was not merely red. Red could be brick, bloodroot, tired apple peel, barn shadow, rust at dusk. Blue was the most difficult blue asked for faith. Her earliest memories were not arranged by holidays or school years, but by small domestic seasons. The sour smell of wet wool in a galvanized tub, the black iron kettle at her grandmother's back steps, the way steam climbed into the maple branches and vanished there like something returning home. Other children learned colours from crayons. Della learned them from weather. Her mother, Elaine Mercer, used to say the girl had been born looking past people's faces toward whatever light was behind them. Elaine said this with a weary softness, as if it were both blessing and trouble. She had worked at the county nursing home before her own body began to fail her, and the work had taught her to move quietly in rooms where other people were afraid. She knew how to lift a person without shaming them. She knew how to fold a blanket around thin ankles. She knew how to speak in a low voice when medicine made a patient forget the year. Della's father had left early enough that he became less a person than a pause in a sentence. There were no photographs of him on the refrigerator. No birthday calls, no old shirts kept for memory. Elaine did not spit his name out, but she did not polish it either. She simply worked, and when the work became too much for her lungs and joints, she tried to keep working anyway. That was the household Della grew up inside. Not tragic, not noble, just exact. Bills under a ceramic rooster, soup stretched with rice, school papers signed at midnight, a mother who sometimes pressed one hand against the counter until the room stopped tilting. On Saturdays, when Elaine had a double shift or later when she needed the day to sleep, Della went to her grandmother. Mabel Ruth Mercer lived 23 minutes out, in a white farmhouse that had leaned slightly east since before Della was born. People in town still brought Mabel fleece wrapped in feed sacks, though she no longer took much paid work. She had been a natural dyer for more than 40 years, and she did not call herself an artist. She said artists could do what they pleased. A dyer had to answer to the plant, the pot, the mineral, the season, and the sheep. Her hands were square and strong, the nails cut blunt, the fingertips stained in colours that soap never fully removed. Madder had left a permanent warmth along the creases of her palms. Walnut darkened her thumbs. Woad gave a faint shadow beneath one nail, a blue so pale it looked like memory. Every weekend had its order. First breakfast, cornmeal mush in winter, toast with apple butter in fall, boiled eggs in spring when the hens began laying with enthusiasm again. Then the sorting table where fleece was opened and picked clean of burrs, straw, and the patient evidence of pasture. Then the notebook. Mabel's dye notebook had a cracked black cover and pages warped from steam. She wrote everything down in pencil, because pencil survived splashes better than ink. Date, weather, fiber weight, mordant, plant source, water source, heat, time, result. She noted the mood of the day too, not as sentiment but as measurement. April rain, pale yolk. Late frost, greenish gold. August drought, harsh orange. Della learned to read those pages before she understood why they mattered. Mabel would put one finger on a line and say, "Do you see how the colour moved?" Della would look at the skein hanging above the stove, and slowly she began to see that colour was not fixed. It leaned, it deepened, it opened under one hand and closed under another. They gathered plants with the same care other families used for Sunday clothes, welled from the dry edge of a field, never pulling the root if there were only a few. Goldenrod cut before it became dusty, black walnut hulls collected in gloves and carried home in buckets that stained the truck bed. Sumac, madder root, onion skin, marigold, pokeberry only for lessons because Mabel said fugitive colours could teach honesty better than permanent ones. Do not trust a colour that arrives too easily, Mabel told her once. Della had been 11, impatient with a skein that looked muddy after 2 careful hours. The sentence stayed with her because her grandmother did not explain it immediately. She lifted the wool with a wooden spoon, let the liquid drain back into the pot, and waited until Della stopped fidgeting. Then Mabel said that the honest colours were the ones that had been asked for properly. Some required alum at the right strength, some needed cream of tartar to soften the hand, some came only when the heat stayed near 140 degrees and did not leap into a boil, some refused a second chance if the dyer hurried. "It is not only wool," she said. That was all. Years later, Della would understand that Mabel had been speaking of people too, of grief, of hunger, of any life that had to be coaxed back from grey without being forced. When Mabel died, the farmhouse changed hands faster than seemed decent. There had been an aunt in Ohio, a cousin with debts, a man from a farm auction company who walked through the rooms with a clipboard and did not remove his hat. Della was 14 then, old enough to know what loss was, and too young to have any legal claim on what had taught her to live. The iron kettle went first, then the drying racks, then 3 crocks, 2 copper ladles, the skein winder, and the old balance scale with brass weights polished by decades of thumb and use. Della stood in the yard with her arms around the black notebook because Mabel had given it to her the winter before, saying only, "You are the one who reads slow enough." No one wanted the notebook that saved it. The rest disappeared into pickup beds and cardboard boxes. For a long time afterward, Della could not bear the smell of wet wool. It seemed to her that the steam had gone out of the world. Elaine tried to comfort her, but illness had already begun its quiet occupation of the house. First the fatigue, then appointments, then the language of specialists, each word careful and cold, chronic, progressive, manageable, not curable. Elaine married again when Della was 16, not out of romance so much as exhaustion. Cal Hobbs owned a narrow rental house on the edge of Greenfield and wore his keys on a brass ring clipped to his belt. He was not loud at first. Loudness would have been easier to name. He was tidy in a way that made every object seem accused. He lined his boots beneath the radiator. He folded receipts into thirds. He counted slices of bread by touch through the plastic bag and marked the milk jug with a black line. He did not strike walls. He did not throw plates. He simply made the air in the kitchen so exact that breathing felt like trespassing. Della learned to move around him. She washed her cup and dried it before setting it away. She kept her mother's pill bottles in a shoebox beneath the bed because Cal disliked seeing them on the counter. She took shifts at a bakery before school, then at a discount store after graduation, then anywhere that would schedule her around Elaine's bad weeks. When Elaine could no longer climb the stairs without stopping twice, Della began missing work. 1 morning became 3. 3 became a warning. The warning became a final check printed on thin paper and handed over by a manager who would not look at the tremor in Della's hands. Cal read the amount and laughed once through his nose. "That will not carry anyone," he said. He was right, but the rightness did not make him kind. By late October, the rent was behind. Della had sold Mabel's silver thimble, then Elaine's television, then a box of Christmas ornaments painted by hand in a year when both of them had still believed the future would leave them something. She kept the dye notebook wrapped in a towel at the bottom of her bag. The eviction came on a morning with sleet tapping the windows. A deputy stood on the porch beside the landlord, a woman named Mrs. Vale, who owned 6 houses and spoke in the sorrowful tone of someone inconvenienced by her own firmness. Della remembered the physical object before she remembered the words. A blue enamel saucepan sitting on the stove with oatmeal cooling in it, the spoon still upright, as if breakfast had been interrupted by weather instead of law. Mrs. Vale held a clipboard against her chest. You had 7 days, the lock changes today. 8 words. Della looked toward her mother, who sat in the armchair with a blanket over her knees. Elaine did not defend her. She did not look at Cal either. She looked at the floor near Della's shoes, at the small puddles forming where sleet had melted from the deputy's boots. Her hands were folded so tightly the knuckles had gone pale. That was the betrayal. Not a sentence, not a raised voice, just silence settling over the room and choosing its side. Cal had already packed his own things, 2 suitcases by the back door, his keys clipped to his belt, his mouth fixed in a line of private arithmetic. He had somewhere else to go. Della understood that before anyone said it. They were allowed 20 minutes. Della took Elaine's medications, 3 shirts, the notebook, a photograph of Mabel standing beside a line of yellow skeins, and the grocery receipt folded around $6.32. The 32 cents went into a bus machine before noon. The $6 stayed folded. For 6 weeks, the world narrowed and lengthened at once. They spent 2 nights in Greenfield at a church warming room where the cots smelled faintly of bleach and old rain. Elaine slept with her coat under her head because the room was too full of coughing. Della sat awake beneath a fluorescent light that hummed without mercy and watched a woman across the aisle mend a glove with dental floss. From there they went to Northampton because a clinic had a charity desk that opened Tuesdays. The clinic gave them numbers, forms, and 1 appointment 3 weeks away. They slept the first night in a bus station corner until a security guard told them, gently enough, that they could not stay after closing. The second night they slept behind a laundromat beside a vent that breathed warm soap into the alley. Money diminished in coins and mistakes. A cup of coffee bought for Elaine because her hands would not stop shaking, 2 bus fares, crackers, a bowl of soup from a diner where the waitress charged them for one and brought 2 spoons, laundry once because illness had its own humiliations and Della refused to let her mother carry them in public. In Springfield, they found 3 nights at a shelter on Worthington Street. Elaine's cough worsened there. Della learned the sounds of sleeping strangers, the soft inventory people make when they still own almost nothing and fear losing even that. Plastic bags rustling, shoes tucked under cots, a man whispering a prayer into his sleeve, a child crying without fully waking. On the 4th morning, Elaine's caseworker found a temporary medical bed in a facility outside Amherst. It was not home, and it was not permanent, but it had oxygen, clean sheets, and nurses who spoke to Elaine by name. Della signed the intake papers with a hand that had forgotten how to be 19. You can visit during hours, the nurse said. Della nodded. There was no bed for her. After that she slept where weather permitted, a hay barn near Hadley, with permission from a farmer who had lost his wife and did not ask too many questions, a church basement in Turner's Falls when the temperature dropped below freezing. One night under the eaves of a closed antique store wrapped in a moving blanket someone had left beside a dumpster. She kept the notebook inside her shirt when she slept because paper could be stolen, and paper was sometimes the last country a person had. The $6 remained. She would not spend it, not because $6 could save her, but because it had become the exact shape of refusal. She could lose rooms, wages, furniture, and the daily evidence of belonging. She would not lose the last folded proof that she had chosen to keep something. The public library in Greenfield opened at 9. By then Della knew which chairs were nearest the heat and which librarian would let her sit without ordering her to the computers. She read local newspapers because they were free and because classified ads gave her a strange comfort. Other people still needed things, snow tires, firewood. A used crib, someone to repair a pump, someone to take away scrap metal. Lives continued in small square boxes, practical and unadorned. The advertisement was on page 12 of a weekly paper near a notice for a church supper and an estate sale of hand tools. County sailed bid disposal. Former wool dyeing house. Uninhabitable, condemned, no utilities. Buyer assumes all risk, fees, removal or repair. Minimum bid, $6. Property located near Shelburne Falls. Inquire Franklin County Clerk. Della read it once, then again, then placed 2 fingers on the words as if they might move. Former wool dyeing house. The phrase opened something so carefully sealed inside her that she had to close the newspaper around her. The library remained patient. A man turned a page in the magazine section. The radiator ticked. Outside, traffic moved through wet pavement with the soft hiss of late November. She did not imagine rescue. She did not picture comfort. A condemned building was not a home simply because a desperate person needed one. She knew enough about rot cold and official language to understand that buyer assumes all risk meant no one would come if the roof fell in. Still the words remained. Wool dyeing house. Shelburne Falls lay west along the old road, near the Deerfield River and the long memory of mills. Mabel had spoken of that region once, of dyers who knew which hillside gave a clearer yellow and which stream changed madder toward brown. Della could not remember the full story, only her grandmother's hand moving over a map, tapping places where colour had once been work and work had once been inheritance. At the clerk's desk, she asked for a pencil. The librarian gave her one without comment. Della copied the address, folded the scrap of paper into the grocery receipt with the $6, and sat there until the light outside began to thin. That evening, she visited Elaine. Her mother was propped in a narrow bed with a plastic pitcher beside her and a TV mounted high in the corner. Sound turned low. Della did not tell her about the advertisement. Elaine's breathing had become too careful for impossible plans. Instead, Della rubbed lotion into her hands, 1 finger at a time, the way Mabel had once rubbed lanolin into washed fleece. When visiting hours ended, Elaine held onto Della's sleeve. "Where are you sleeping?" Della looked at the blanket, at the white hem folded back with institutional precision. "Somewhere warm enough." Elaine closed her eyes. There are silences that ask forgiveness without having the strength to say the word. Della stood beside one, then bent and kissed her mother's forehead. Before dawn the next morning she made her decision in the bathroom of the bus station, washing her face with cold water from a sink that would not stay running unless she held the handle down. She counted what remained, the folded 6, 2 nickels and 1 penny. The nickels would take her part way, her feet would do the rest. She put Mabel's notebook in her bag wrapped in the towel. She tucked the advertisement beside it. Then she stepped outside into the November dark, where the air smelled of diesel, wet wool and distant snow. By noon, the road west had begun to rise. And somewhere beyond the river bends and bare walnut trees, a condemned dye house waited with its cellar sealed, its copper pans cold, and its forgotten door facing the road as if it had known she was coming. The first bus left Greenfield while the storefront windows were still black. Della sat halfway back with her bag against her ribs and Mabel's notebook pressed flat beneath both hands, as if the road might reach in and take it. The heater under the seat gave out a burnt metal smell, and every time the driver shifted gears, warm air moved along the floor in tired breaths. A man in a knit cap slept across the aisle with his mouth open. 2 seats ahead, a woman carried a paper sack of prescriptions and kept checking the label as though the words might change by morning. The bus took her through Turner's Falls, then across open stretches where the last corn stubble stood like dull bristles under frost. The sky had the low pewter colour of late November, and the hills ahead looked folded, one behind another, patient and cold. She counted stops, not miles. A girl learns quickly, once she has no room of her own. That distance is easier to bear when broken into small permissions. At the last stop she could afford, the driver glanced at her through the mirror. "This is you." Della stood, steadying herself with one hand on the seat back. "Yes, sir." He opened the door onto a road shoulder where weeds rattled under ice. The bus pulled away with a cough of diesel, leaving her in the breathless quiet between towns. She had copied the route from a library atlas, but paper distances had lied to her. The road west kept lifting and turning. It moved past stone walls, dark barns, sugar maples stripped to bone, and mailboxes leaning under the weight of winters that had not yet arrived. By mid-afternoon, her socks were damp. By 4, the light began withdrawing from the fields. A pickup slowed once, then went on. 2 dogs barked from behind a split-rail fence. Crows crossed above her in a rough black line. She kept walking because stopping gave the cold a clearer invitation. The air had sharpened to 31 degrees by the bank clock in the last village, and after the sun dropped behind the ridge, it fell lower. Later, a radio voice from a gas station door would say 26. She believed it. The cold had become exact. That night, she slept in a hay barn with the permission of nobody, because nobody was there to ask. The barn stood beyond a sagging gate, its red paint scoured to brown along the windward side. Inside, the hay was stacked high beneath rafters darkened by dust and swallow nests. Della climbed into a hollow between bales, pulled her coat around her knees, and tucked the bag under her sweater. Mice moved somewhere below. The hay smelled of summer stored too long, sweet at first, then dry enough to scratch the throat. She did not sleep deeply. Cold woke her every hour, and each time she opened her eyes, she saw a narrow band of moonlight laid across the barn floor like watered silk. Once she heard deer moving outside, their hooves light in the frozen grass. Once she dreamed of steam rising from a dye pot and woke with her fingers curled as if around a wooden spoon. Near dawn the temperature had fallen to 22 degrees. She ate the last 2 crackers from her pocket, shook hay from her sleeves and stepped back onto the road with the careful stiffness of someone whose body had spent the night defending itself. Shelburne Falls appeared not all at once, but in pieces. First the sound of water, not seen yet, moving under the morning, then a church steeple lifting above bare branches, then a row of buildings set close to the street, each with its own face and history, each holding the practical manners of a town that had watched many people arrive and leave without making a ceremony of either. There was McCusker's Market with vegetables stacked in wooden crates behind the glass. There was Baker Pharmacy, its green sign weathered at the corners, a bell tied to the door with a red string. There was the Shelburne Falls Coffee Roasters storefront sending out the deep smell of roasted beans and toast. There was Salmon Falls Gallery with pottery in the window, bowls the colour of river stones and late blueberries. There was a narrow hardware shop called Harlan and Son, though the paint on the sign had worn away so that the ampersand looked like a bent nail. Across the river, she could see the bridge of flowers sleeping through winter, its planters cut back, its structure bare and honest without bloom. The Deerfield River moved below with a green-black steadiness, carrying the sky in broken pieces. Della stood near the curb longer than she meant to. Town life made its ordinary music around her, tires on wet pavement, a delivery cart rattling over boards, a woman shaking a rug behind a cafe, 2 men greeting each other outside the market with the brief nods of people who had known one another too long for many words. No one looked at Della harshly. That almost made it harder. Harshness could be met with a lowered face, a prepared silence. Ordinary kindness required the body to remember how to receive. The county clerk's office sat in a brick municipal building that smelled of old varnish, damp wool coats and paper that had passed through too many hands to remain innocent. The hallway floor was worn pale along the middle from decades of shoes. A bulletin board near the entrance held notices for flu shots, dog licenses, a church rummage sale, and a meeting about road salt. Della wiped her shoes twice on the mat before entering the office. There were 3 counters, 2 metal filing cabinets, a calendar with a covered bridge on it, and a clock that clicked with deliberate authority. Behind the counter sat a woman in a grey cardigan, her white hair cut blunt below her ears and pinned on one side with a tortoiseshell clip. Her nameplate read M.R.S. Elinor Whitcomb in black letters rubbed thin by years of dusting. She looked up from a ledger. Yes, Della stepped forward and took the folded advertisement from her bag. Her fingers had trouble opening it. I came about the sealed bid disposal. Mrs. Whitcomb put on narrow reading glasses attached to a chain. She did not take the paper at once. She looked at Della first, and that look was neither unkind nor welcoming. It was the look of a person trained to know that signatures could ruin lives if people did not understand what they were signing. Which property? The wool-dyeing house. The clerk's mouth tightened with recognition. That one. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Whitcomb took the advertisement then and read it. Though she must have known every word, she rose slowly and went to a filing cabinet behind her. The drawer opened with a metallic scrape. From it, she removed a manila folder tied with cotton tape. When she returned, she placed the folder on the counter but kept one hand resting on it. You understand it is condemned? Yes, ma'am. You understand there are no utilities? Yes, ma'am. No water service? No electric meter? No sewer connection recorded? Yes, ma'am. You understand the county will not repair it? Yes, ma'am. You understand that accepting title means accepting liability for injury, collapse, contamination, trespass, and removal if the structure cannot be made safe. Della swallowed. The words were formal, each one like a stone placed in a row. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Whitcomb removed her glasses and let them hang against her cardigan. You have seen it? No, ma'am. For the first time, the office seemed to pause. Somewhere behind the wall, a typewriter or printer began its small labour and stopped. The clock clicked twice. You have not seen it? No, ma'am. Do you have someone with you? No, ma'am. Do you have a contractor? No, ma'am. Do you have funds for repair? Della looked down at her hands. They were red at the knuckles from cold and washing in public sinks. No, ma'am. The clerk did not sigh. That was to her credit. She opened the folder and turned several pages, then took out a form with the county seal printed at the top. The minimum bid is $6. It was set that low because the demolition estimate exceeds the land value after hazardous removal. Most people who inquired left after reading the report. Della nodded. Mrs. Whitcomb tapped one paragraph with the end of her pen. There may be chemicals. Yes, ma'am. Old dye works used mordants. Alum is ordinary enough. Copper, iron, tin, sometimes worse, depending on who worked there and when. Bottles break, labels lie, cellars flood. Yes, ma'am. There may be animals inside. Yes, ma'am. There may be rot under any floorboard. Yes, ma'am. The clerk held the pen still. You understand, she said, and now the phrase did not sound like procedure. It sounded like one woman asking another to step back from a river before the ice gave way. Della met her eyes. I understand enough to know I don't understand all of it. Mrs. Whitcomb studied her. That answer seemed to travel somewhere behind the older woman's face, to a room where she kept judgments she did not speak at the counter. At last she slid the form forward. Print your legal name. Della did. The letters looked narrow and young on the county paper. Mrs. Whitcomb watched as she unfolded the grocery receipt. The $6 had been folded so many times the bills held their creases like old cloth. There was a $1 bill with a torn corner, another soft from washing, and 4 singles flat enough to seem emptied of all former owners. Della placed them on the counter. The clerk did not touch the money at once. When she did, she counted it carefully, then wrote a receipt in blue ink. The brass stamp sat near her elbow, heavy and square, its handle darkened by use. She pressed it into the red pad and brought it down on the form with a sound that seemed too final for so little money. Received. The word appeared beside Della's name. Mrs. Whitcomb turned another page. The deed will record upon acceptance for county disposal. This office can issue provisional transfer today. Final filing after the assessor signs the release. You will need to return for the registered copy. Yes, ma'am. The clerk wrote directions on a half sheet of paper. From here, cross the river and take Bridge Street west until it meets the Mohawk Trail. Continue past the old mill road. There is a turn near a stone culvert, unmarked now. You will see 2 walnut trees and a chain across a rutted drive. The house sits back from the road. Do not go after dark. Della looked through the window. The afternoon had already begun leaning toward evening. Mrs. Whitcomb noticed, "Go tomorrow. I don't have a place for tonight." The words came out before Della could stop them. She felt heat rise to her face, not from shame exactly, but from the exposure of having said the true thing in a public office. Mrs. Whitcomb's expression changed only slightly, her gaze lowered to the bag, the worn cuffs, the shoes gone pale with road salt. "What is your family name again?" Della pointed to the form. "Mercer." The clerk's fingers, which had been arranging the papers, went still. "Mercer." "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Whitcomb looked at the name as if it had been waiting in the room before either of them arrived. "Are you any relation to Mabel Mercer?" Della could not answer quickly. The sound of Mabel's name spoken by a stranger in that office moved through her like warmth and injury at once. "She was my grandmother." The older woman took off her glasses again, slower this time. "I knew your grandmother," she said. Della held the counter with one hand. Mrs. Whitcomb looked past the office, past the clock and calendar and metal drawers, into some years stored in her own keeping. "She came here for a dye demonstration in the 70s. My oldest was in 4th grade. Mabel brought skeins the colour of marigold, apple bark, walnut, and one blue I have never forgotten. She made the children smell the wet wool before she let them see it, said colour should not be separated from the world that made it." Della looked at the manila folder, at the stamped paper, at the $6 lying in the county tray. "She said that?" "She said many things. Most of us were too hurried to hear them." Mrs. Whitcomb opened a drawer under the counter. From it she took a small envelope, slipped the $6 inside, and wrote D. Mercer bid payment across the front. Then, instead of placing it in the cash box, she set it in a shallow wooden tray beside her ledger. "I will hold this until deposit goes through in the morning." Della did not know why that mattered, but the gesture had a tenderness so concealed that it could have been missed by anyone not starving for such things. The clerk reached for a ring of keys and removed one with a paper tag. "The county chain uses this padlock. The building door itself may not hold. If there is a second lock, it is not ours." She placed the key on the counter. Della looked at it a long moment before taking it. "Thank you." Mrs. Whitcomb folded the directions again, making the crease sharp. "There is a Methodist church on Main, with a basement door on the side. Reverend Boyd opens it on cold nights when he has volunteers. I cannot promise anything, but if you tell Doris at the cafe I sent you, she may know if someone is there. Doris. Bridge Street Cafe, green awning. She hears everything before the rest of town admits it happened." Della nodded and tucked the paper away. At the door, Mrs. Whitcomb called her name. Not Della. "Miss Mercer." Della turned. The clerk's hand rested on the manila folder now, not as a warning but as a keeping. "If you go out there tomorrow, carry light, and do not step where you cannot see the floor." "Yes, ma'am." Outside, the cold had thickened. Della stood under the municipal building awning, holding the key in her fist until its teeth printed themselves into her palm. Across the street, the cafe windows glowed yellow, and inside she could see a woman wiping a counter, her hair tied up in a scarf the colour of cranberry jam. The basement at the church was open that night. Doris did know. She was broad-shouldered, quick-eyed, and wore a flowery apron over a black dress. She did not ask Della for proof. She gave her a bowl of white bean soup in a paper cup, 2 heels of bread wrapped in a napkin, and instructions spoken as if Della had merely misplaced a thing everyone misplaced once. "Side door. Knock twice. Tell Boyd I said." Reverend Boyd was tall and stooped, with dark skin, silver eyebrows, and a wool scarf wrapped carefully around his neck. He opened the basement door himself. There were 6 cots set out, a coffee pot, and a stack of donated blankets. Della slept between a woman who murmured in dreams and an older man with swollen hands who kept his boots under his pillow. The church basement smelled of dust, coffee, and floor wax. For the first time in 3 nights, Della slept flat. Morning came pale and windless. The volunteers had oatmeal in a pot and coffee so weak it looked apologetic. Della ate standing near the wall, then folded her blanket and thanked Reverend Boyd. He tipped his head once, as if thanks was something to be passed along, not kept. By 8, she was walking. She crossed the river on Bridge Street. The water below ran dark beneath ledges and stones, its surface shouldering light in long broken strips. Storefronts opened behind her, a broom scraped a threshold, someone dragged a trash bin across gravel. The day had begun its ordinary work, and Della moved out of town with the county directions folded in her coat pocket. The road climbed toward the Mohawk Trail. Cars passed now and then, leaving wind against her legs. She kept to the shoulder where weeds had collapsed under frost. To her right, a row of houses watched the road from behind bare lilacs and stone walls. One had blue shutters and a porch swing chained up for winter. Another had 3 bird feeders and a stack of split maple under a tarp. Smoke rose from chimneys without hurry. A yellow dog followed her from one property line to the next, barking with official concern but no real malice. At a mailbox shaped like a barn, he stopped, gave one last bark and turned back as if he had completed his duty. Beyond the houses, the road grew quieter. The walnut trees appeared before the drive did. They stood on either side of a break in the roadside brush, tall and black-limbed, their branches holding the sky in a net of thin winter lines. Beneath them the ground was littered with holes gone soft and dark, staining the snowless earth around them. The chain Mrs. Whitcomb had mentioned hung between 2 iron posts, low enough to step over, silvered with frost along the top. Della took out the key. The padlock resisted at first. She breathed into her hands, rubbed the key between them, and tried again. This time the lock opened with a reluctant click. The chain dropped into the leaves with a sound like old crockery breaking. The rutted drive curved inward. It was longer than she expected, perhaps 100 yards, cutting through sumac, blackberry canes, and young birch that had come up since anyone regularly passed that way. Her shoes slipped in frozen mud. Twice she had to lift branches away from her face. The land dipped, then rose slightly, and there the building came into view. The wool-dyeing house was not large. It stood low to the ground, a rectangular brick structure about 28 feet long and 16 feet wide, with a steep slate roof broken open near the north edge and patched in places with rusted tin. The bricks were dark red, almost brown where rain had carried soot down from the chimney. A single chimney rose from the rear wall, square and stubborn, its cap missing. The front door was plank, grey with weather, hanging beneath a shallow wooden hood sagging on one side. 4 windows faced the drive, 3 held no glass. One had a cracked pane still clinging to the muntins, cloudy and warped like ice. Above the door, a narrow signboard remained, though most of its paint had gone. Della stepped close enough to read the ghost of lettering beneath lichen and weather. W. A Barlow daughter, wool scoring and dyeing. The final line had worn away almost entirely. Only a few letters remained, spaced like teeth. Morda. She touched the sign with 2 fingers and felt the grain raise under her skin. The building had a smell even from outside. Damp brick, cold ashes, fallen leaves gathered in corners, something mineral too, faint and sour, as if stones themselves had been steeped in vinegar long ago. She walked around once before trying the door. The north wall had taken the worst of weather. Water had entered through the roof opening and darkened the brick below. Moss grew in the mortar joints. At the rear, the chimney leaned less than she feared but more than she liked. A rusted stovepipe lay in the weeds. Near the back step, a half-buried iron ring suggested some old drain or cover she did not yet have courage to examine. To the east, land sloped toward a narrow creek hidden by alders. Beyond it rose a stand of maple and hemlock. To the west, the 2 walnut trees kept their watch beside the drive. There were no near neighbours, though one farmhouse roof showed through branches far up the road. Della returned to the front. The county key did nothing for the door because there was no lock left to open. A hasp hung loose, and the door itself had swollen against the frame. She set her shoulder to it gently at first, then harder. Wood complained. Something inside shifted. On the 3rd push, the door gave inward with a long scraping sound that seemed to wake the whole building. Cold air came out. Not fresh air, stored air. It smelled of dust, old wool grease, brick damp, and the faint metallic tang of copper left too long in silence. Della stood at the threshold and let her eyes adjust. Light entered through broken windows in angled strips, catching motes that rose and drifted with the care of Ash. The front room had once been a receiving space. She could tell by the counter built along the left wall, its surface scarred by blades and dark rings from jars. A wooden scale shelf remained above it. Pegs lined the opposite wall, some still holding loops of brittle twine. The floorboards were wide pine, cupped by years of weather, grey along the centre path where feet had carried work in and out. A ledger desk stood near the window, one drawer missing, the other swollen shut. In the far corner lay a heap of burlap sacks that had collapsed into themselves. When she touched one with her shoe, it crumbled. Dust lifted and made her cough into her sleeve. The back room was larger and darker. Here the work had happened. 2 copper vats sat in brick settings along the rear wall, their rims greened with verdigris and dust. Beneath them were fireboxes with iron doors, one hanging open, one closed tight with rust. A long wooden draining rack crossed the room beneath a beam. Hooks hung from it at different heights. Some iron, some wood, all waiting with the strange dignity of tools that had not forgotten their purpose. Against the right wall stood shelves crowded with jars, crocks, and tins. Most were empty. A few held dark powder, curled leaves, or hardened cakes of something that had dried decades before. Labels where they survived had browned to the colour of tea. Alum, iron, madder, weld walnut. The handwriting differed from Mabel's, but the discipline was familiar enough that Della felt her throat tighten. In the centre of the room, the floor changed. The boards there were newer than the surrounding planks, though still aged, and they formed a square about 8 feet across. A brass ring lay flat in one board near the edge, nearly hidden under dirt. The county report had said mordant cellar. Della knew enough not to pull it open at dusk. Mrs. Whitcomb's warning returned. Do not step where you cannot see the floor. So she did not. Instead, she made a first inventory by sight and caution. Roof opening north side, broken glass, possible cellar, copper vats intact, fireboxes unsafe, shelves unstable, no fresh animal droppings except mice, no smell of gas, no sound of water running where it should not. A place could be ruined and still not be finished. She found a broom without bristles near the door and used its handle to test boards before crossing them. Tap, step, tap, step. The rhythm slowed her until the building seemed to accept her weight one careful foot at a time. By late afternoon, the light had begun withdrawing from the windows. Della gathered fallen paper, dry leaves, and broken twigs from the receiving room, not to burn, only to clear a corner. She would not risk a fire yet. The chimney had waited too long for trust. She chose the driest part of the front room, away from the roof leak and far from the cellar square, and spread her towel on the floor. There was no bed, no lamp, no door that shut properly. She wedged the door from inside with a fallen brick. Then she sat with her back against the counter and listened. Buildings speak differently after dark. During the day they show their injuries, at night they reveal their habits. The roof ticked as cold settled into slate. A mouse moved in the wall with tiny deliberate feet. Wind entered through the broken windows and crossed the room in thin streams, somewhere below the floor, or perhaps only within the brick itself. There was a faint hollow coolness that seemed deeper than the room. Della took out Mabel's notebook, but did not open it. Her hands were too cold, and some books should not be asked to comfort more than they can. She ate one heel of Doris's bread slowly, saving the other. She drank from the bottle she had filled at the church. Then she lay down with her bag under her head, the county directions folded in her pocket, the key tied into the corner of her scarf, and the dark form of the copper vats visible through the doorway. The smell of the place changed as she lay there. Beneath the damp and dust came something softer. Wool, maybe. Ash. Old plant matter. The kept breath of work. Outside, a branch scraped once against brick. Then again. The sound was almost like someone at the wall, patient enough not to knock. Della opened her eyes. Moonlight entered through the cracked pane and stretched across the floor until it touched the brass ring set into the newer boards. It shone there, dull and round, like an eye that had been closed for a very long time. She watched it until sleep took the edges from the room. The house had not saved her, not yet. It had only made a place where she could lie down without being asked to leave. The first 3 days taught Della the difference between shelter and home. Shelter was a roof that did not fall before morning. It was a wall between her ribs and the wind. It was a floor wide enough for one body to sleep on. If the sleeper knew which boards to trust and which to cross with a broom handle first, home was still a word kept far away, folded like a clean shirt in a drawer she did not yet own. On the first morning, she found the well. It stood behind the building, half hidden by alder and blackberry cane, a round stone mouth capped with 2 weathered planks and a rusted iron strap. The county report had made no promises about water, and she was careful not to receive the well as a gift before it had been tested. She cleared leaves from the stones, knelt, and listened. Far below, after a long silence, she heard one small drop answer another. The rope had rotted. The bucket was gone. She marked the place with 3 stones set in a triangle, not because it made the well safer, but because order was sometimes the first form of courage. Until she could ask about testing, she would carry water from town in whatever bottles she could find. The outhouse stood farther back, tilted but upright, with its door hanging by one hinge and a crescent moon cut into the wood. She opened it with a branch and stepped away while the stale air escaped. Inside were 2 wasp nests, empty for winter, and a floor that needed replacing before any person trusted it. Still, it was there. A person without many choices learns to value the presence of things before they are usable. By noon, she knew the first 8 floor sounds. The receiving room gave a dry chirp near the counter, a low-groan 3 boards from the door, and a sharp complaint beneath the window where water had entered for years. The back room was more complicated. Around the vats, the boards held firm. Near the shelves, they dipped under the heel. Beside the square in the centre, where the brass ring lay flat, the floor gave back a deeper note when tapped. Not weakness exactly, but absence beneath. She did not open it. Not yet. Instead, she cleaned what she could see. She swept leaves into piles with a bristleless broom handle and a scrap of cardboard. She carried broken glass outside in the crown of an old tin lid. She pulled burlap away from the wall and found mouse tunnels, a cracked yardstick, and 3 wooden clothespins blackened with age. Every object seemed to have waited without asking to be useful again. The second day, she walked back into town before the sun had warmed the road. Her empty water bottles knocked together inside her bag. Frost lay along the ditch grass. The yellow dog watched her from his yard and did not bark this time, as if she had been entered into the neighbourhood record and found harmless. Harlan and Son Hardware had a bell that rang with a dry little tremor when she opened the door. Inside, the store was narrow and deep, with wooden floors worn low between shelves. The air smelled of seed packets, lamp oil, rubber boots, sawdust, and metal drawers full of nails. Glass front cabinets held hinges, hasps, chisels, mason line, stove gaskets, and small mysterious tools whose names belonged to people who already knew their use. Behind the counter stood a man with a silver beard trimmed close to the chin and hands permanently darkened around the nails. He wore a brown canvas apron over a flannel shirt, and a pencil rested behind his ear, as if it had been born there. His left eye watered slightly in the bright store light. The sign over the register said Harlan and Son EST, 1934, but his receipt pad read Benjamin Harlan in neat blue print. He looked at her shoes first, then her bag, then her face. Morning. Morning, sir? What are you after? Della placed her bottles on the counter. I need to ask whether there is a public pump. There's a spigot behind the fire station if it hasn't frozen. Don't drink from the river unless you want the river to make decisions for you. Yes, sir. He watched her for another second. You the one bought Barlow's dye works? Della had not known the building still had a name in other mouths. I signed for it. That is a careful way to answer. It is all I have done so far. The corner of his beard moved. Not quite a smile, but something related. He came around the counter more slowly than his voice moved. One knee was stiff. He walked with the settled patience of a man who had lifted heavy things for 50 years and now negotiated with each stair. From a shelf near the back, he took a small paperback with a green cover, its spine cracked and taped. County used to hand these out when people still believed a homeowner could learn what a house needed before calling 3 trucks. He put it on the counter. The cover read Basic Repair for Old Houses. Della touched the edge of it. I cannot buy that today. Didn't ask you to. She looked up. He took the pencil from behind his ear and opened a ledger under the counter. You'll need some things before you need advice. Gloves, lantern, mason line, dust mask, chimney brush if that flue is anything like I remember, nails, maybe a pry bar, though I'd rather you had someone with you before you pry anything important. I cannot pay all at once. I know. He wrote her name without asking how to spell it, then looked at her and corrected the last letter before she spoke. Mercer? Yes, sir. Your grandmother dyed my mother's wedding shawl, pale brown, almost pink when sun hit it. My mother called it September tea. Della looked down at the counter, because the room had tilted a little. Mr. Harlan turned the ledger toward her. I keep accounts for people I expect to see again. If you do not come back, the book will still be here. I will come back. Then you can pay a little at a time. I do not want charity. Good, I am poor at giving it. He opened a drawer and began setting things out, not quickly, not generously in a way that wounded, but as if he were building a sensible beginning. 1 pair of cotton work gloves, 89 cents. 1 heavier pair, used but whole, no charge written, only marked loan. A packet of dust masks, $1.10. A small bottle of lamp oil, 45 cents. A box of kitchen matches, 12 cents. 2 candles, 6 cents each. A second-hand kerosene lantern with a dented chimney, $2 written on the ledger, though the tag hanging from it said 5. He added a 6-foot pry bar, loaned. Bring it back when you have learned not to use it badly. Yes, sir. A stiff wire brush, 75 cents. A hand scraper, 40 cents. 1 pound of 8-penny common nails, 32 cents. 1 pound of 10-penny nails, 38 cents. 20 feet of clothesline, 29 cents. A cheap notebook, 14 cents. I have a notebook. Not for roof leaks, chimney notes, and prices. Keep the other one for what it is. She did not ask how he knew there was another. He took the old house manual and pressed it into the pile. Read the chapter on chimneys before you put flame under anything. I will. Read it twice. Yes, sir. Then read it again, because fear forgets paragraphs. Della nodded. At the spigot behind the fire station, she filled 4 bottles and carried them back in turns, 2 in the bag and 2 in her hands. The weight pulled at her shoulders. By the time she reached the drive, her palms had gone numb around the plastic, and the yellow dog had decided to accompany her as far as the walnuts, where he sat down and watched her disappear into the sumac. That evening, she began the chimney chapter. The manual's language was plain and severe. Inspect from bottom to top. Check for blockage, nesting, cracked flue tile, loose mortar, creosote accumulation, separation from surrounding structure. Do not assume draft. Do not light a fire in an unexamined flue. Smoke damage may signal hidden failure. Carbon monoxide kills silently. She read the chapter once by the weak grey light from the broken windows. She read it again by lantern. She read it a 3rd time with her finger under each line, because Mr. Harlan had been right. Fear did forget paragraphs. On the 3rd morning she began with the fireboxes beneath the copper vats. The left door opened after soaking its hinges with a little oil and tapping them with the handle of the scraper. Inside was a compacted mass of ash, brick flakes, and what had once been a bird nest. She removed it with a dented tin cup and carried each load outside to a pit she scratched into the frozen ground. The ash was fine and grey, but beneath it lay black, glossy sheets of creosote that had fallen from the flue and hardened like broken pottery. She tied a dust mask over her mouth. It smelled faintly of paper and warehouse. The right firebox took longer. Rust had closed its latch, and she worked at it with the wire brush until her hands cramped. When it opened, a wing of soot dropped onto her shoe. She froze, listening to the chimney above. Nothing shifted, nothing fell. A building could forgive slow work. It resented force. She cleared from below first, as the manual instructed, scraping the throat of each firebox, then reaching into the lower flue with the wire brush and dragging down loose deposits. The creosote came away in flakes, black and sharp-edged, smelling of tar, smoke, and years of damp heat. She filled 2 pails, then 3. Her arms blackened to the elbow despite the gloves. At noon she rested outside on the back step with water and the second heel of Doris's bread. The creek beyond the alders spoke under ice, a low continuous mutter. Above it the bare trees moved without leaves, the branches clicking with a sound like knitting needles. Then she climbed. The roof was not safe, so she did not go onto it. Instead, she used the rear bank where the land rose near the chimney, standing on a flat stone and then on the stump of an old locust post. It gave her enough height to look into the top with a mirror. Mr. Harlan had lent her from a box marked oddments. The chimney cap was gone, just as she had seen from below. The flue was narrowed by soot and debris, a long dead nest wedged near the bend. No daylight came through when she looked from below. She could not afford a chimney sweep, and she did not own proper rods. Mr. Harlan had not offered those, perhaps because a person could do only so much with pity before it became unsafe. What he had given instead was a narrow flue brush with a threaded socket, and 3 mismatched lengths of metal rod from some earlier stove kit, each bent a little, each usable if handled with patience. She worked from the bottom first, rod into brush into flue, push, turn, pull. Again, soot fell in soft rushes, then harder flakes, then a clatter that made her step back fast, one hand over her head as pieces of nest and mortar fragments dropped into the firebox. She waited, counted to 30, listened. The chimney remained standing. By the 2nd hour, her shoulders burned. By the 4th, her hair smelled of soot even under the scarf. She took breaks not by time, but by trembling. When her hands shook too much to control the rods, she stopped, drank water, and read the manual paragraph again. When she could feel the tool properly, she returned to the flue. Near dusk, daylight appeared. It was narrow at first, no wider than a buttonhole, high above the firebox. She cleaned until the buttonhole became a pale, uneven square. Then she carried the mirror outside and angled winter light down from above. Inside, in the black throat of the chimney, light answered. She did not light the fire that night. She was too tired, and tiredness made people careless. Instead she washed as best she could with cold water in a basin made from one of the empty crocks. Black water ran over her wrists and left grey crescents under her nails. She slept with her arms aching so sharply that every movement woke her, but she slept inside walls she had made slightly safer by her own labour. On the 4th morning, she went back to Harlan and Son. Mr. Harlan looked at the soot ground into her coat cuffs and nodded once. Found daylight? Yes, sir. Any loose brick? Some flakes. No big pieces after the first fall. Draft. I have not tested. Good. He sold her 2 feet of stovepipe he said had been waiting 20 years to be useful, 1 elbow with surface rust, and a handful of stove cement wrapped in waxed paper. He added a small thermometer with a cracked glass face. Old, but it reads close enough. Do not trust your hand for heat. Back at the dye house, she fitted the pipe temporarily into the left firebox opening, packed gaps with stove cement, and waited as long as she could bear. The manual said cure time mattered, cold weather slowed it, hunger argued otherwise, hunger lost. Late that afternoon she built her first fire. Not in the firebox under the vats. Not yet. She used the smaller iron stove she had found behind the draining rack, its belly rusted but sound, its short legs standing unevenly on a brick pad near the back wall. She had cleaned its little flue separately and connected it to the same chimney through a lower thimble. She laid the fire small twisted newspaper from the library recycling bin, dry twigs gathered under the hemlocks, 3-finger-thick pieces of fallen maple split with the borrowed hatchet Mr. Harlan had allowed her to carry after much warning. The match flared. For one breath, smoke rolled toward her. Then the chimney pulled. The flame narrowed, leaned and took hold. Paper browned, curled and vanished. Twigs snapped. The first real warmth entered the room, not as comfort, but as proof. Della knelt before it, hands open, face turned slightly aside, watching the smoke draw upward where smoke ought to go. She did not cry. She set water in a small tin cup on the stove and waited for it to tremble. Her first hot meal in the house was oatmeal thinned with too much water and salted with 1 packet from Doris's cafe. It tasted of smoke, metal, and deliverance made plain. She ate it slowly with a spoon that had been in her bag for weeks, scraping the bottom clean because waste had become a language she refused to speak. After that, the workroom changed. Warmth, even a little, altered what the eye could bear before the fire. The place had been only condemned, cold and obscure, with the stove ticking faintly and a cup of water steaming on its top. The workroom began to divide itself into tasks. She inventoried it in the cheap notebook. 2 copper vats, both set in brick, left rim dented, right handle missing. 3 iron fire doors, 1 cracked at hinge. 1 draining rack, oak, 10 feet long, surface stained black-green near centre. 14 hanging hooks, 9 iron, 5 wood. Shelving south wall unstable. Jars alum 3, iron liquor 1 sealed, 2 empty. Tin, label unreadable. Cream of tartar, hardened, madder root dry. Weld stems dust. Woad cake possible. Walnut hull powder, sealed crock, cracked lid. Tools, wooden paddles, 6, 2 split, copper ladle 1, enamel basin chipped, wool cards 1 pair, teeth rusted but present, skein winder broken arm, balance scale base, no weights, thermometer, broken glass rods 4 wrapped in cloth. Paper, labels, invoices, 1 calendar page from 1948, 3 receipts for wool delivery, 1 child's drawing of a sheep in blue pencil. She wrote slowly. Not because the list required beauty, but because naming a thing properly kept it from becoming debris. Near the back shelves, she found a narrow cabinet whose door had swollen shut. The pry bar would have opened it, but Mr. Harlan's warning stood between her and impatience. She worked the edges with the scraper for almost an hour, easing dirt from the frame, then tapping each corner lightly with the heel of her hand. When it opened at last, it gave up the smell of cedar and mineral dust. Inside were small drawers, each labelled in a tidy hand. Mordants, acids, alkalis, test skeins. She did not disturb the chemicals. Instead she opened the bottom drawer, where bundles of wool samples lay wrapped in paper, each tied with cotton thread. The colours had faded but not vanished. Yellow gone straw pale, brown deepened towards smoke, red softened to dried rose. Blue still present, honest and stubborn, the last light in a winter room. She placed them back exactly as found. Only after inventory did she return to the square of newer boards in the centre of the floor. By then, the brass ring no longer looked like mystery alone. It looked like a task postponed until the hands were steadier. She swept the boards around it twice. She knelt and brushed dirt from the seams. The square had been cut carefully, not patched in haste. 4 boards joined by battens underneath, perhaps a hatch, the ring folded flat into a recessed plate. She tapped the surrounding floor with the broom handle. Pine gave a warm wooden note. The hatch gave a lower sound. She tapped again at each corner. The northwest corner sounded solid, the southeast carried a faint echo. She pressed 1 palm against the ring plate and felt no movement. Then she took the pry bar and set its end into the narrow gap along the east seam. She did not lift. She listened. The wood did not complain under slight pressure. No cracking, no shifting of surrounding boards. She set the bar aside and tested the weight by hooking 2 fingers through the ring. The hatch did not rise. On the 3rd attempt, with both hands and her heels braced wide, it moved a fraction and stopped. Dust broke along the seams. She stood, heart beating hard from effort rather than fear, then went outside for breath. The late afternoon air was colder than the room now. The creek carried a skin of ice along its edges. She washed her hands in snow gathered from a shaded patch behind the wall, dried them on her coat, and returned. This time she used the clothesline. She threaded it through the brass ring, tied a knot Mabel had taught her for lifting wet skeins, and stood back so the hatch would rise toward her rather than under her. She pulled gradually. The boards held, then released with a thick wooden sigh. Cold air came up from below. It smelled of stone, alum, damp earth, and the strange dry bitterness of old chemicals sealed in glass. The opening revealed a set of narrow steps descending into darkness, not many, perhaps 7 or 8, stone walls close on either side. At the bottom, a fieldstone floor showed in the lantern light, uneven and pale with dust. Della did not go down that evening. She set a candle at the top step and watched its flame. It leaned downward, then steadied. She lowered the lantern on the clothesline until it hung 3 steps below. The light held. No sudden extinguishing, no visible vapour. Still, she remembered Mr. Harlan's warning about cellars, labels, and bottles that lied. She closed the hatch before sleeping. All night, the room knew what had been opened and shut again. On the 5th morning, she went to town and asked questions without pretending bravery. Mr. Harlan listened while weighing roofing nails for another customer. When the man left, he came around the counter, locked the door though the sign still said open, and drew a rough sketch of cellar safety on the back of an invoice. Ventilate first, no flame until you know air moves. Tie the hatch open, take the lantern but keep it high. Do not touch bottles. If you smell almonds, rotten eggs, strong vinegar, anything sharp enough to sting, you leave. If you feel lightheaded, you leave. If a step shifts, you leave. Pride kills faster than ignorance. Yes, sir. He gave her a second dust mask and a piece of chalk. Mark what you move. At the dye house, she propped the hatch with a brick, then tied it open with clothesline fastened to the draining rack. She opened the front door, both rear shutters, and the broken windows needed no help. Wind crossed the room for an hour while she sat outside on the step, waiting. Patient work often looked like idleness to people who had never been saved by it. At last she descended. 7 steps, granite, worn shallow in the centre. The cellar was about 12 feet by 15 feet, its ceiling low enough that she had to bow her head. Fieldstone walls held the earth back with uneven dignity. Along one side stood shelves built of thick planks and brick supports. The jars there were arranged by type, not abandoned. Alum in stoppered glass, iron solution in brown bottles, copperas, cream of tartar, chalk, oak galls, sumac, a few labels she did not understand and would not touch. The smell was strong but not violent. Mineral dust, earth sour tannin, old damp wood. At the far wall behind a shelf of alum jars, something looked wrong. Not dramatic. Not hidden to the careless eye, a small wrongness of line. Della held the lantern higher. The brickwork behind the shelf matched the rest of the wall except for one brick, just below shoulder height. Its edges were cleaner. The mortar around it was not the same colour. When she tapped the wall with the chalk, most bricks answered with a dull, settled sound. That one gave a thinner note. She left it alone and inspected the shelf first. The jars were heavy. She moved them one at a time, marking their positions with chalk on the plank before lifting, then setting each on the fieldstone floor in exact order. Alum crystals caught the lantern light like frozen sugar. One jar had a cracked stopper but remained sealed with wax. Another bore a date written in brown ink, 1936. When the shelf was clear, she tested the brick again. Hollow. The word did not need to be spoken. She ran the scraper around the mortar. It crumbled more easily than it should have. Not fresh, but not original. Her breath sounded too loud in the low room. Above her, wind moved across the open hatch, and the rope creaked softly where it held the door up. The brick loosened after 20 careful minutes. Behind it lay darkness, no wider than a bread loaf. Della set the brick on the floor exactly beneath the opening, and reached in only as far as her fingers could see by lantern light. Her fingertips touched cloth, then wood, a round edge. She drew out a cedar disc first, about the size of a saucer, smooth and dark, set against the opening like a scent seal. Its cedar smell rose fresh despite age, sharp and clean amid mineral dust. Behind it were packages wrapped in oilcloth, tied with cotton tape gone brown. She took them one at a time. Not quickly. The first package was long and narrow. She carried it upstairs before opening it, because the cellar seemed too solemn a place for haste. In the workroom, on the cleared counter, she untied the tape and folded back the oilcloth. Inside lay tools. A small brass thermometer in a fitted wooden case, a bone-handled awl, 2 glass stirring rods wrapped in flannel, a set of tiny measuring spoons marked in grains, a dyer's paddle, no longer than her forearm, made for samples rather than vats. Its handle had been worn smooth by a thumb that must have rested there for years. The second package held raw material. Not treasure in the ordinary sense, better. Small muslin bags labelled in the same hand as the cellar shelves. Madder, turkey root, weld seed, Southfield, woad cake, second fermentation, cochineal bought Boston, used sparingly, walnut hull, river tree, hard frost year. Each bag had been sewn shut with tiny deliberate stitches. The third package was heavier. It held a tin box wrapped twice in waxed cloth. Della sat back on her heels before opening it. The fire had gone low in the little stove. Light from the broken windows lay across the counter. Dust moved in that light with unbearable gentleness. The tin lid resisted. She worked the edge with the awl, careful not to bend it more than necessary. At last it opened with a dry sigh. Inside was money. Not loose, not thrown in, bundled, counted, kept. Bills lay flat in paper bands, their edges darkened but clean. Silver coins were stacked in cloth rolls. A few gold-coloured coins sat in a separate envelope, though when she lifted one she saw it was not gold but a worn brass token from a mill company store. Beneath the first layer was another, then another. Della closed the lid again. Her hands had begun to shake, and trembling hands made mistakes. She stood, went outside, and walked to the walnut trees. The air was bright and severe. A crow landed on the far fence post and watched her with one black eye. She stayed there until her breathing returned to its proper size. Then she went back inside and counted. She counted on the counter, with the cheap notebook open and the old pencil sharpened with a knife from her bag. She made columns. Bills first, silver next, odd coins after. She did not trust the first count. She counted again. There were $20 bills from old series folded in groups of 10. $10 bills fewer. $5 bills many. $1 silver certificates. Blue seals faint but clear. $half walking liberty. Franklin and 3 older barber halves worn nearly smooth. Quarters standing liberty. Washington silver. Dimes, Mercury dimes in paper rolls so dry they cracked when handled. Nickels, Buffalo, some dateless, one with 1937 still sharp. Pennies, wheat cents, mostly 1919 through 1944. At the bottom was one small envelope containing coins wrapped in tissue, 2 Morgan silver dollars, 1 peace dollar, and a worn Indian head cent from 1901. The total came to $33,600.17. She wrote the number down and stared at it. Then she crossed it out and counted a third time. $33,600.17. No number in her life had ever taken up so much room on a page. Under the money lay a small velvet pouch, faded from blue to grey. Inside was a military medal, its ribbon brittle but intact. The bronze had darkened, but the shape remained clear, a cross-patée with an eagle at the centre. A World War I Victory Medal rested beneath it. The clasp marked Meuse Argonne on the back of a small card. Tucked with the ribbon was a name and year. Thomas W. Barlow. 1918. She held the card by its edges. The house seemed to grow still around that date. There was also a sealed letter. Not in an envelope from any post office, but folded sheets wrapped in wax paper and tied with blue thread. The outer page bore no address, only a line written in careful pencil. For the one who opens when need has made them careful. Della did not open it. The refusal surprised her. Need had made her many things: hungry, cold, watchful, exact. It had not made her ready for a dead person's voice. She placed the money back in the tin, not as hurriedly as she had found it, but in clean order. bills together, coins separate, medal in its pouch, letter on top. Then she closed the lid and sat beside it until the room darkened. Night came early under the broken roof. She lit the lantern, but not the stove. The unopened letter seemed to contain enough flame. Instead, she carried the tin box to the receiving room, then stopped, changed her mind, and brought it back to the counter where the tools lay. Some things should remain near the work that explained them. She went outside. The air had turned blue with cold, down beyond the alder. The creek moved under a skim of ice, black water showing where the current held itself open. Della walked toward it slowly, feeling the ground through the thin soles of her shoes. The sky above the ridge was nearly clear, and one star had appeared early, low and white. She stood at the bank and listened. Water over stone, wind through dry weed heads, a branch clicking against another branch. Far off, a vehicle passing on the road and then gone. The money inside the house was more than escape, and because of that it frightened her. Escape was simple. Escape meant bus fare, rent, medicine, a door that locked, a bed for one night and then another. This was not simple. This money had been placed inside a wall by hands that measured alum in grains and labelled seeds by field. It had waited through owners, weather, county reports, neglect, and the careless arithmetic of demolition. It had not been lost, it had been kept. Della crouched by the creek and washed her soot-stained fingers in water cold enough to ache. She did not make plans. Plans were too loud for that evening. She watched the current carry leaves beneath the thin skin of ice, and thought of Mabel lifting wet skeins from a pot, waiting for the colour to show itself honestly in the air. She thought of Elaine's hands folded pale on the blanket. She thought of Mrs. Whitcomb pressing the brass stamp down, Mr. Harlan writing credit in a ledger, Doris wrapping bread without asking for a story, Reverend Boyd opening a church door in the cold. Small things had carried her here. Not grand mercy, not rescue, not some blazing sign. A bowl, a cot, a road direction, a name remembered, a key placed on a counter. The world, which had taken so much, had also passed her along by hand. When the cold reached her knees, she stood and went back to the dye house. The lantern inside made the windows glow faintly from the roadside, not bright enough to invite anyone, bright enough to say a person was there. She closed the door, wedged it with the brick, and sat on the floor beside the counter, the unopened letter above her and the old tools laid out in a row. For the first time since she had crossed the threshold, the building did not feel empty. It felt occupied by waiting. The house had not saved her, not yet. It had only made a place where she could lie down without being asked to leave. Morning entered the dye house without warmth. It came pale through the broken panes and spread itself thinly across the counter, the tools, the tin box, the folded letter tied with blue thread. Frost had formed along the inside edge of one window where breath and weather met during the night. The little stove was cold. The ashes inside had settled into a soft grey dish, and when Della opened the door to check them, the smell of yesterday's fire rose faintly, honest and small. She did not touch the letter at once. First she swept the floor near the counter, then she carried the empty tin cup outside and filled it with a little clean snow from the shadow of the north wall, where dirt had not reached it. She set the cup on the stove and built a careful fire, no bigger than her hands could manage. While the snow melted, she washed her face with cold water from a bottle and braided her hair with fingers stiff from sleep. Only then did she sit before the letter. The blue thread had faded where it crossed the folds. It had been tied with a square knot, not fancy, not decorative, useful. The waxed paper around the pages had yellowed at the creases but held. When she lifted it, there came a smell so faint she had to close her eyes to find it. Cedar, dust, dried plant root, and something like lavender, long past bloom. She saw the handwriting before she knew why her breath stopped. It was not Mabel's. The loops were narrower, the downward strokes more severe, the spacing more formal, as if the writer had been taught penmanship with a ruler close by. Still, there was a family resemblance in the discipline of it, the careful pressure, the way numbers stood upright and letters did not lean toward drama. This hand had measured things. This hand had written temperatures beside sorrows and names beside roots dug from hillsides. This hand had left instructions for someone poor enough, desperate enough, or patient enough to open a wall without breaking what was around it. Della untied the thread and placed it beside the tin. The pages unfolded along their original creases. She began to read. "My dear one, whoever you are, if these pages have reached your hands, then the house has outlived the noise made around it, and so have you. I do not know your name. I do not know whether you come from my blood or from another line entirely, and I have tried, while writing this, not to prefer one over the other. Need makes kin as surely as birth does. Work makes kin too, when the hands are honest and the heart does not hurry. I write because Dr. Nathaniel Crowe of Northampton has told me the growth in my breast has moved beyond his skill. He spoke gently on the 17th day of October 1949, in a room that smelled of carbolic soap and coal smoke from the street. He did not promise what he could not give. I respected him for that. He said I may have months, perhaps less if winter is hard. I have no daughter living, no son returned, no apprentice who stayed. I have jars on the shelves, a roof already asking for mercy, and knowledge enough to do harm if it is found by careless hands. So I have hidden what I could not bear to see auctioned, burned, or thrown away by men who think a woman's work becomes rubbish when her voice stops. My name is Esther Winifred Barlow. I was born Esther Winifred Hale in Conway, Massachusetts in 1876, when my mother still kept madder root drying above the stove and my father cut ice from the pond every January. My mother was Lydia Ann Mercer Hale, born in 1849 near Ashfield, daughter of Ruth Eliza Mercer, who came over the hills from Buckland with nothing but a spinning wheel, a dye pot, and 2 children after her husband died of fever. Ruth learned walnut and sumac from an Abenaki woman whose name she wrote only as Marie because that was the name given to her in town, and not, I suspect, the name that belonged to her. Before Ruth, there was Annabel Price Mercer, born in 1818 in Deerfield, who married a fuller and dyed homespun for soldiers' stockings, mourning dresses, cradle blankets, and whatever else the valley required. I tell you these names because work disappears when names are not tied to it. Men carved their initials in beams, women left colour in cloth and hoped somebody noticed before it faded. The house you stand in was built by William Asa Barlow in 1888, the year after I married him. He set the brick himself with my brother Jonah and a mason from Charlemont named Pike. The vats came used from a mill closing in Holyoke. The first winter we had more smoke than heat, and I ruined 20 pounds of wool by trusting a thermometer that read 10 degrees low. William laughed until he saw my face. Then he helped me bury the whole grey mess behind the walnut tree. You may still find the iron hook there, if the roots have not swallowed it. We made a living here, not a fortune. Wool came in from Coleraine, Heath, Row, and farms farther west along the Mohawk Road. We scoured, mordanted, dyed, rinsed, dried wound, and wrote down what changed. The writing was half the work, remember that. A colour made once is a lucky accident. A colour made twice is the beginning of knowledge. The event that closed the trade came on March 4th, 1921. A warm rain fell on snowpack all through the night, and the Deerfield rose mean and fast by morning. The mill downstream lost part of its lower wall, and 3 families lost their stored wool. Our house did not flood above the cellar steps, but the road washed out, orders stopped, and by the time repairs came, the new chemical dyes had arrived cheap enough that no farmer's wife could be blamed for choosing them. They were bright, obedient, and quick. They did not ask anybody to gather weld in July or save onion skins all winter. The store shelves filled with colours that had no smell of field or bark. I do not condemn them. Hard lives choose ease when ease finally knocks. Still, something closed. For more than 30 years after, I kept the place in smaller use. A shawl here, a wedding blanket there. Skeins for those who still wanted a brown with a living heart in it, not a flat one. Children came sometimes from the school. They liked the blue best and hated waiting for it. Adults were worse. They wanted the secret to indigo in one sentence, and I told them the secret was oxygen, patience, and not poking what must rest. I lost William to pneumonia in 1917 before our son came home from the war. I lost our boy, Thomas William Barlow, in France in 1918 during the Meuse-Argonne fighting. The medal in this box was sent after his body was already buried far from the hills that raised him. My brother Jonah did not return from the Spanish-American War in 1898. Fever took him in camp before he saw battle. War has many ways of calling itself noble, while mothers wash socks in kitchens, keep the medal clean. Do not sell it unless life itself requires it, and if life requires it, do not be ashamed. Shame belongs to those who waste the living, not those who survive. If you mean to dye wool here, begin with humility and clean water. For 1 pound of washed wool, use alum at 15% of the fibre weight and cream of tartar at 6% if you want the hand softer and the yellow clearer. Dissolve both fully before adding the wool. Bring the bath slowly to 140 degrees Fahrenheit and hold it there for 1 hour. Do not boil. Do not crowd the pot. Let the wool cool in the mordant bath overnight when you can. Rinse gently. Wool remembers roughness. For weld, use 100% plant weight to fibre if dried, more if fresh and stemmy. Soak overnight if the stems are hard. Heat the plant material for 2 hours below a simmer. Strain through cloth, then enter the mordanted wool warm. Keep the bath between 150 and 160 degrees. Too much heat dulls the yellow towards straw. A pinch of chalk brightens it if your water is soft. Iron after bath will turn it olive, but iron is a stern teacher. Use 1% or less. For madder. Break the root, but do not grind it to dust unless you want mud. Soak overnight. Bring no higher than 180 degrees, and lower is safer. 2 hours gives orange red. Longer gives brown if the root is tired or the water hard. Add calcium if needed. Do not boil madder unless you are grieving and willing to see what grief does to red. For woad you will need courage. Fresh leaves must be chopped, covered with water near 170 degrees, steeped 40 minutes, strained, then beaten with air until the liquor blues. Add washing soda little by little until the vat turns greenish and the foam carries blue. Reduce with care. I used bran and patience when I had both. Dip the wool slowly. It will come out yellow-green and turn blue in the air. Let children see that part. It teaches them that some truths appear only after breathing. The notebook with these pages holds 200 recipes and more mistakes than triumphs. Do not hide the mistakes from yourself. The valley taught each colour differently. Walnut from the river tree goes blacker after hard frost. Sumac from the dry hill gives clearer tan than sumac from the ditch. Goldenrod before rain is not the same as goldenrod after 3 hot days. If you carry anything forward, carry that. Colour is not only plant, it is soil, weather, water, vessel, hand and hour. The money is not wealth, it is time stored in paper and silver. Use it slowly, repair before improving, eat before decorating, pay honest people before buying beautiful things. Keep part of it hidden again if you are able, because the future is always sending somebody barefoot toward a door they cannot yet see. Inheritance is not ownership, though the law may use that word. Inheritance is being trusted by the dead not to make their lives smaller. If you cannot continue this work, protect the house until another can. If you cannot protect the house, protect the notebook. If you cannot protect the notebook, protect one true recipe and give it to someone with patient hands. I have been alone here a long while, but I have not been empty. The walls know steam, the bricks know fire, the cellar knows the weight of jars put away in order. The walnut trees know the sound of women stepping out at dusk to cool their faces after work. If you are frightened, that is reasonable. If you are tired, sit down. The house has waited through worse weather than one human sorrow. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Esther Winifred Barlow, November 29th, 1949. Della read the letter once without moving. Then she read it again, slower, because the first reading had gone through her like cold water and left too much behind to gather. On the second reading, she noticed the places where the pencil had pressed harder. No daughter living, no son returned, repair before improving, eat before decorating, the sentence about shame, the sentence about madder and grief. When she finished the second time, the fire had settled low, and the melted snow in the tin cup had begun to steam. She folded the pages along their original creases, not new ones, pressing each line gently with the side of her thumb. The blue thread lay beside the tin. She did not tie it yet. Some things needed to breathe after being opened. Her hands moved carefully, but the rest of her body did not seem to belong to the morning. She stood, sat again, then stood once more. The room around her held its ordinary facts: broken windows, copper vats, dust on shelves, a manual from Harlan and Son lying open near the stove. Yet everything had shifted. The building no longer felt abandoned, it felt entrusted. She took the letter and the lantern and went out the back door. The air was sharp enough to bring tears that had nothing to do with grief. Behind the dye house, frost silvered the weeds. The creek moved under its thin edges of ice, and beyond it the woods rose in quiet layers of brown, grey, and evergreen. She walked toward the walnut tree Esther had mentioned, the larger of the two, the one with a trunk wide enough that two children could have hidden behind it. At first she saw nothing. Only fallen hulls, old leaves, exposed roots lifting like knuckles from the ground. Then, near the base where the earth sloped away, she found a dark curve of iron half buried under moss and leaf mould. Della knelt and cleared it with her fingers. A horseshoe. Not a storybook horseshoe nailed over a door for luck, but a working shoe, rusted, heavy and real. One end had been drawn slightly thinner from use. The roots had grown around it, holding it partly in place, as though the tree had accepted it over decades and refused to release all of it. Beside the horseshoe, barely visible beneath dirt, was an iron hook. William's ruined wool the first winter, the grey mess buried in shame or laughter or both, a young woman once standing where Della now knelt, trying to learn what kind of mistakes a house would forgive. Della touched the horseshoe and left it where it was. She did not need to own that proof, finding it was enough. When she returned inside, the light had strengthened a little. The dye house seemed less grey. Not bright, not repaired, not safe beyond its few known paths, but less grey. In the cedar-sealed opening behind the place where the letter had been hidden, she had found one more small object wrapped in cloth. She had not opened it the day before because the tin box and the letter had taken all the space her heart could make. Now she brought it to the counter. Inside was a candle. It was short, hand-dipped, beeswax gone deep amber with age, wrapped in muslin and tied with a strip of faded red wool. A note, no larger than a leaf, had been tucked beside it. Last candle from Lydia's Bees, 1889. Light when the house receives its next keeper. Della held it for a long time. A practical person would save such a thing. A hungry person would not waste light that could not be replaced. A frightened person might keep it as proof, unopened, untouched, preserved against need. But Esther had written light, not save. So Della set the candle in a chipped saucer, struck a match, and touched flame to the old wick. For a second, nothing happened. Then the wick took with a small blue bead, warmed, and rose into yellow. The beeswax softened near the flame, and released a scent unlike the paraffin candles from Harlan's store: honey, sun on dry grass, the inside of a hive. A summer so far gone it should not have been able to enter a condemned room in winter. Yet there it was, standing in light no wider than 2 fingers. Della placed the candle beside the folded letter. The flame moved when wind found cracks in the wall, but it did not go out. She sat on the floor with her knees drawn up and let the room show itself by that older light. Copper rims glowed dull green. The wooden paddle's worn handle darkened. The labels on the jars seemed less like warnings and more like names waiting to be spoken correctly. Even the broken windows held the flame in small, trembling copies. She thought then, not in a rush, but as one bead follows another on thread, of the people who had carried her without saying they were carrying her. The waitress in Northampton who had charged for 1 bowl and set down 2 spoons. The farmer near Hadley who had pointed to the barn and said only mind the ladder, the librarian in Greenfield who gave her a pencil and did not ask why her hands shook. Mrs. Whitcomb who had said Mabel's name as if returning a lost object, Doris with bread wrapped in a napkin, Reverend Boyd opening the basement door, Mr. Harlan writing credit into a ledger before he knew whether she could repay a cent. None of them had solved her life. Perhaps that was why their kindness could enter it. They had not made speeches over her, they had not asked for her whole sadness as payment, they had simply placed 1 small plank across 1 small gap, and by crossing each, Della had arrived at a room where a dead woman called her dear. If you are watching this from a warm chair tonight, Maybe you remember one of those small plank moments in your own life, not the grand rescue people tell at weddings or funerals, but the quieter mercy, a sandwich handed across a counter, a ride offered in rain, a teacher who kept a classroom open after the bell, a neighbour who shoveled the step and never mentioned it, a nurse who used your name when you had begun to feel like a chart. If someone once gave you one small kindness that helped you keep going, write it in the comments. There may be a person reading who needs to know that such things still matter. Della did not know how long the candle burned before she moved. The flame shortened gradually, lowering itself into its own pool of amber. She made herself eat oatmeal from the tin cup. Though the first spoonful went cold before she remembered to swallow, she counted out no money. She made no list of repairs. She did not run to town with the news. Some discoveries become smaller when dragged too quickly into daylight. By afternoon, she took the notebook of recipes from the tin box and placed it beside Mabel's notebook. The two books did not resemble each other. Esther's was bound in brown leather, its corners darkened, its pages numbered in a hand that expected to be obeyed. Mabel's cracked black notebook lay swollen from steam and years of use, the pencil marks looser, the margins full of later thoughts. Yet side by side they seemed to speak across the counter without Della's help. She did not read the recipes yet. She had learned from the letter that inheritance was not to be swallowed whole. It was to be received in portions the body could carry. As evening came, she returned the letter to its waxed paper, tied the blue thread around it, and set it in the tin box with the medal, money, and tools. Then she placed the tin under the counter where she could reach it from her sleeping place. The old candle burned nearly to the saucer. She left beside the stove until the last thread of smoke vanished. That night she did not sleep on the floor as she had before, curled tightly against cold and uncertainty. She arranged the room. It was not much. The folded towel became a pillow. Her bag rested against the counter. The lantern sat within reach but turned low. The tin box stayed on one side of her, Mabel's notebook on the other, and Esther's letter beneath her hand for a while before she placed it back where it belonged. Outside, the walnut branches tapped once against the brick, then stilled. The dye house settled around her with its broken roof, its unwashed jars, its cold cellar, and its long memory of women who had kept colour alive through sickness, war, flood, poverty, and silence. Della lay awake, listening until the sounds became familiar. Mouse in the wall, wind at the window, ash shifting in the stove, the distant creek carrying winter downhill. Before sleep came, she reached toward the tin box and touched its lid. Not to count what was inside, only to know it was there. Then she slept with the heirlooms beside her, the room darker than before and somehow less empty. The first snow came on December 3rd, thin at dawn and heavier by noon, until 3.5 inches lay on the drive, the walnut roots, the broken roof, and the moss-dark bricks of the dye house. Della woke before light because the building had changed its breathing. Snow softened the sounds outside, but inside it made every leak more deliberate. Meltwater found the north opening and fell into a dented copper pan she had placed there the night before. 1 drop every 5 seconds, then 1 every 3, then a small uneven tapping that filled the back room like a clock no one had wound. She stood beneath the worst place and looked up. The roof did not need admiration, it needed work. She read the roof chapter in Mr. Harlan's manual 3 times, sitting beside the little stove with her finger under the lines. Roof pitch, rafters, sheathing, felt, flashing, drip edge, slate removed only where necessary. Do not trap water under patching, do not cover rot and call it repair. Those sentences seemed written by someone who had known more than houses. She measured from inside first because the snow made the outside slope treacherous. The damaged section ran nearly 12 feet along the north plane, from the chimney shoulder toward the front corner, and about 6 feet down from the ridge. The rafters beneath were not all gone, but 2 had softened where water had entered, and 1 had cracked close to the wall plate. She drew the measurements in the repair notebook, then drew them again because the first drawing looked like fear. At Harlan and Son, she stood near the stove while her socks steamed inside her shoes. Mr. Harlan looked at her figures, then took a carpenter's pencil and corrected the angle of the roofline. You need more than shingles. I know. You need to keep yourself from sliding off. I know that less. He set down the pencil. Then we begin there. The materials went into the ledger in a column that made Della's stomach tighten, 2 bundles of cedar shingles for the patched area. Though he warned they would not match the slate and did not need to, 1 roll of 30-pound roofing felt, cut down and priced by the foot, 5 pounds of galvanized roofing nails, 2 8-foot lengths of 2x6 spruce for sistering rafters, 1 sheet of 1/2-inch exterior plywood, ugly and temporary but dry, 1 length of step flashing near the chimney shoulder, tar paper, chalk line, roofing cement, and a used canvas safety rope that had belonged to someone more confident than she was. Dimensions say you could do it with less, Mr. Harlan said, if weather were kind. Is weather kind here? No. He disappeared into the back and returned with a hatchet whose handle was wrapped in old friction tape. This was my uncle's roofing hatchet. He died before he forgave anyone for asphalt shingles. I cannot buy it. I am not selling it. She did not touch it yet. He laid it on the counter between them. Bring it back sharp. Yes, sir. Before she left, he wrote a name on the back of a receipt. Elias Pruitt lives past the cemetery road. Former roofer, bad shoulder, worse temper, he will say no. Then why ask him? Because sometimes no is how a man clears his throat before yes. Elias Pruitt came the next morning in a wool coat buttoned wrong, a black watch cap pulled low, and boots that had known tar, ladders, barns and years. He was 78, narrow as a rake handle, with a face made mostly of bone and weather. His right shoulder sat lower than his left. He carried no toolbox, only a thermos and a carpenter's square. I don't roof any more, he said. Della stood in the open doorway. Yes, sir. I don't climb for foolishness. Yes, sir. I don't take pay from hungry children. Della's hand tightened on the door edge. I am not a child. He looked past her at the vats, the hatch, the patched sleeping corner, and the stovepipe drawing clean smoke. No, he said, you're not. He did not take pay. He did not take thanks easily either. He accepted coffee from Doris, brought in a jar by Reverend Boyd, and 1 bowl of oatmeal because he said cold hands made stupid work. He taught in sentences of 5 words or fewer. Foot sideways. Wait over the ladder. Never trust wet moss. Chalk before cutting. That nail's proud. Pull it. For 11 days the roof became the whole world. They worked when the frost held and stopped when the snow softened. Elias would not let Della climb until he had walked the roofline from a ladder and mapped the safe places with chalk. He set the ladder himself, dug its feet into frozen soil, and tied it to the walnut trunk with a knot he made her untie, and tie again until he stopped grunting. The cracked rafter had to be sistered. Elias showed her how to cut the new 2x6 to length, set it alongside the failing member, clamp it tight, and fasten it with staggered nails, so the strength transferred along the wood instead of splitting it. When she drove the first nail too high, he tapped the spot with 1 finger. Wood does not forgive panic. She pulled the nail. The chalk line pleased her. It was an honest tool, blue dust in a little metal case, a string stretched tight between 2 points and snapped against rough wood to leave a straight mark where the eye would have wandered. Della loved it at once. She loved that the line appeared because tension was held correctly, not because anyone wished it straight. The 3-stroke nail took longer. Elias could set a roofing nail with 3 movements: place, drive, seat. No flourish, no wasted force. Della bent 10 nails before she found the rhythm. Her wrist wanted to strike from fear. Elias made her stop, breathe, and try again. Your arm's too loud. She learned to listen for the seated sound, the small flat note of metal meeting shingle without bruising it. She learned to overlap felt so water would descend over each layer and not sneak beneath. She learned that roofing cement stuck to gloves, sleeves, hair, and dignity. She learned that cold made cedar smell sharper when cut. On the 7th day, snow began while they were still on the ladder. Elias looked at the sky, Then at the unfinished patch. Down. We have 2 rows left. Down. She climbed down. 10 minutes later, a gust came hard over the ridge and sent powder skittering across the roof where her knees had been. Della stood in the yard, watching the place she had wanted to remain, and understood another kind of instruction. By mid-December, the roof did not look beautiful. The patch was plain, cedar against slate, a visible mending, but water no longer fell into the copper pan. The new felt lay tight under shingle. The sistered rafter held. The flashing near the chimney diverted meltwater away from the brick shoulder. On the final afternoon, Elias stood in the drive with his thermos and looked up. It'll shed, that was all. From him, it was a benediction. Della returned the roofing hatchet to Mr. Harlan 2 days before Christmas. She had cleaned the head, oiled the handle, and wrapped it in cloth. Mr. Harlan inspected the edge. "You sharpened it?" "Yes, sir." "Too much." "I am sorry." He set it under the counter. Better than not enough. Outside the hardware store, wreaths hung in the windows of the market and cafe. People carried parcels under their coats. The river ran dark beneath early ice. Della walked home under a sky the colour of pewter, and for once, when snow began again, she did not look up with dread. By January, the chimney began asking for its turn. The roof had stopped the worst of the water, but years of wet weather had left the upper bricks spalled and tender. Their faces had broken away in flakes, exposing softer red beneath. Around the firebox throat, old mortar had powdered to sand. When Della brushed it with 2 fingers, it fell in pale grains onto the hearth. She could make a small fire, but not a trusted one. The manual's chimney section became her winter gospel for 3 weeks. She read about lime, breathability, heat, expansion, and the danger of smearing hard Portland cement over old brick that needed to release moisture slowly. Mr. Harlan approved of the warning, then complicated it with the knowledge of a man who had watched many good intentions crack in February. "Hydraulic lime," he said, setting a bag on the counter. "Not too rich, fire clay near heat, sand sharp enough to matter." He wrote the mix on a scrap of cardboard. For exterior repointing above the roofline, 1 part natural hydraulic lime, 2½ parts sharp sand, dampened slow. For the firebox throat and hot joints, 1 part fire clay, 1 part fine sand, 1 part lime, with water added until it held on the trowel without slumping. "Do not butter it like toast," he said. "No, sir. Pack the joint, respect the depth." "Yes, sir. Cold will lie to the cure." "Yes, sir." January stayed in the 20s most days, sometimes rising to 31 by noon, then falling hard by dusk. Della worked in fingerless gloves until her hands went numb, then warmed them around the stovepipe every 15 minutes. Bare hands were needed for some things. Mortar told its readiness by touch. Too wet, and it shone slick against the brick. Too dry, and it crumbled before the joint accepted it. She raked old mortar carefully with a narrow chisel and a bent screwdriver Elias had ground for her. The sound was unpleasant and exact. Scrape, loosen, brush, blow, pause. She cleaned each joint to a proper depth where she could, never forcing what would damage the brick more than it helped. Inside the workroom, she hung a cloth to keep dust from the shelves. Outside, she stood on the rear bank and worked the lower chimney courses from the ladder, refusing the topmost section until Elias came by and steadied the rope without comment. Powdered mortar collected in her cuffs. Brick dust reddened the snow. The first week was demolition so slow it hardly looked like progress. The second was packing joints. She learned the small satisfaction of a pointing trowel sliding mortar into an empty seam. She learned to press, cut, and brush back after the first set, leaving the joint slightly recessed, so rain would not sit proud against it. She learned that masonry did not reward impatience. If she hurried, the mortar smeared across brick faces, and Mr. Harlan's voice rose in memory. Respect the depth. At night her fingers throbbed with returning blood. She slept with her hands tucked beneath her arms and woke with them stiff enough that buttons were a negotiation. Still she went back. A failing chimney was not only an inconvenience, it was a moral problem, because fire trusted the path built for it. On the coldest morning, 20 degrees and wind from the north, she nearly quit before noon. The mortar stiffened too quickly. Her fingers lost feeling before she could finish one section. A patch she had made the day before showed hairline cracks, because she had warmed the room too fast after working near the interior throat. Della crouched beside the stove and looked at the cracked line until it seemed to look back. Then she scraped it out. She mixed again, smaller this time. She warmed the bricks gently with a pan of coals held nearby, not against them. She dampened the joint with a brush. She packed the mortar in layers no thicker than her patience allowed. It held. That evening Reverend Boyd left a pair of wool mittens on the doorstep. No note, no knock, just mittens, thick and dark with darned thumbs. Della saw his footprints going back toward the road and did not call after him. Some thanks would have made the gift too heavy. The third week, the chimney began to look less wounded. Not new. New would have been wrong. Its bricks remained varied, smoke-dark, chipped and winter-worn. But the gaps were closed, the throat was sound, the stovepipe sat tighter in its thimble. The draught, tested with a twist of smoking paper, drew clean and steady. Late in January, after 3 days of cure and a thaw that brought dripping from the eaves, Della made the test fire. She laid it smaller than hunger wanted. 1 sheet of twisted paper, kindling, 2 split sticks, no more. She opened the damper, crouched near the stove and struck a match. The flame took the paper, crawled into the twigs and rose. Smoke lifted. For a moment the room held its breath with her. Then the chimney gathered the smoke and carried it upward in a single clean pull. Outside, she walked around to look. A thin grey line rose from the chimney into the cold air, straight at first, then bent east by wind. No smoke leaked from the brickwork, none rolled back into the room, none seeped from the roof shoulder. Della stood in the yard until her ears ached. Inside, the stove began to tick with heat. She warmed both hands over it, palms down, then palms up. The warmth did not erase the weeks of numb fingers, but it answered them. That was enough. The floors had waited under everything. Under the soot, the dust, the fallen leaves, the mouse tracks, the carried water, the roofwork, the chimney mortar, the sleeping towel, the lantern, the tin box, and the careful paths Della had learned by sound. They were white pine planks, wide and old, fastened with hand-cut rose-head nails that caught light at uneven angles when the dirt was cleared from around them. In late January, once the chimney could hold heat safely, she began to bring the floors back. She did not call it restoration. That word sounded too confident. She called it cleaning until cleaning became repair. First came the lifting of what did not belong. Splinters, broken glass hidden under the counter, mouse-chewed paper, the grey mats of old burlap, grit packed into seams. She worked with a putty knife and brush, clearing each line between boards. The rose-head nails appeared one by one, dark squares and diamonds sunk into pine. Some sat proud. Those she tapped gently with a nail set borrowed from Harlan's drawer of patient tools. Mr. Harlan rented her a random orbit sander for $14 a day, though he did not allow her to take it until she had drawn him a diagram of which boards would be sanded and which would not. Machines remove history fast, he said. I will go slow. Machines don't care what you intend. So she practiced first on a broken plank from the back corner. The sander shook her arms to the shoulder and filled the room with the smell of warmed pine, dust and something older released by friction. She wore a mask. She sealed the cellar hatch with cloth. She covered the jars on the shelves. Even so, dust found everything. The first pass was 80 grit. It did not beautify the floor, it humbled it. Grey dirt lifted. Scratches changed shape. Old water stains remained, darker and more honest than any fresh board could have been. Della moved with the grain, never dwelling too long, letting the sander float rather than dig. She stopped every few minutes to kneel and check nail heads, because sparks and old metal were not company she wanted. The second pass was 120 grit. The pine began to show its colour then, not bright, not pale, but a dark honey tone where feet had polished it and a deeper amber near the walls. In the receiving room, a path emerged from the door to the counter, worn by decades of people carrying fleece, invoices, jars, and weather in their coats. She did not try to erase it. A path was not damage, it was testimony. The third pass was 220. By then her back had stiffened from bending, and her hands tingled from the machine long after she shut it off. She returned the sander after one day, because $14 was a loud number, and because the house had taught her that doing less with attention was better than doing more in a panic. The finish took longer. Tung oil was expensive, linseed oil was more possible. Mr. Harlan mixed advice with warning and sold her a small amount of pure tung oil for the highest wear places, then boiled linseed oil for the rest, with rags to be soaked afterward in water and laid flat outside because oily rags could burn a building down without a match. Spontaneous combustion is not poetry, he said. Yes, sir. She applied the first coat with a lint-free cloth, working it into the pine until the boards drank and darkened. The colour changed under her hand. Dark honey deepened toward mahogany in the old path by the counter. Near the stove, the wood took on a warm brown glow as if firelight had entered and stayed. She wiped away excess, waited 48 hours to cure enough for the next coat, then another, then another. 3 coats, each one thinner than desire. During those curing hours she had to step only on boards left untreated or move along planks she had laid like bridges. The house became a puzzle of restraint. She cooked near the back wall, slept in a corner not yet oiled, and learned that improvement could make life more difficult before it made it easier. Then came the bad morning. No storm marked it, no fresh failure. The roof held, the chimney drew, the floor shone softly under the third coat, but Della woke with a tiredness so deep it felt laid into her bones by generations. The thought of carrying water made her close her eyes. The thought of scraping one more seam, washing one more rag, recording one more price, mending one more broken thing, seemed suddenly impossible. She sat up, then did not stand. For a long while the stove went unlit. Cold gathered around her knees. Light moved across the wall. A mouse made one small sound behind the shelves and fell silent, perhaps surprised by her stillness. At last she put on her coat and walked away from the house. Not to town, not for supplies, not for help. She walked past the well beyond the alder, along the creek until it widened into a marshy place where cattails stood brown and ragged above the ice. There she sat on a fallen log and watched the morning arrive fully without her labour. A great blue heron stood in the shallow open water near the far bank, motionless as a carved thing. Its body was the colour of smoke, its neck folded, its thin legs placed with impossible care. Della watched it for nearly an hour. The heron did not hurry because she was tired. It did not comfort her. It did not instruct her. It simply remained exact and alive in the cold, waiting for what the water might offer. She did no work that day. She returned before dark, lit the stove, ate bread. Doris had left the evening before and wrote one line in the repair notebook. No work. Heron at marsh. The next morning she woke and rubbed the final coat into the floor. February entered through the windows because the windows had never stopped admitting it. There were 8 in all. 4 faced the drive, 2 open toward the creek, and 2 small ones set high in the back room had once allowed steam to escape during dye days. 3 had no glass at all. 4 were cracked so badly the pieces rattled when wind crossed the room. 1 remained original, or close enough to original that Mr. Harlan removed his cap when he saw it. "Do not replace that," he said. It was the narrow east window near the counter, with wavy glass that bent the walnut branches into soft wavering lines. The muntins were hand-planed. The sash had been repaired at least twice, but the glass itself held bubbles and faint distortions like water trapped in time. "I won't," Della said. "Many would. I am not many." "No," he said, "you are learning not to be." Window work was colder than chimney work in some ways because it required still hands in moving air. She began with the empty openings, tacking heavy cloth across them at night and removing it by day so she could scrape, fit, measure and learn. The old putty had hardened to stone in places and softened to grey paste in others. She used a glazing tool borrowed from Mr. Harlan, a putty knife, a box of glazier's points and DAP 33 glazing putty that came in a can with a lid reluctant to open. "Warm it in your hands," Mr. Harlan told her. "Cold putty fights everyone." He showed her on a scrap sash in the store. Roll the putty into a rope, bed the glass gently, press, but do not bully, set points to hold the pane, 2 per side or more if the sash asks for it. Lay the putty at an angle so water sheds, not sits. Draw the knife in one steady pull, clean the line, leave it alone. Most people ruin putty by touching it again. Della nodded. At the dye house, she repaired the first sash badly. The angle wavered, the corner lumped, her thumbprint remained near the bottom edge. She scraped it out and did it again. The second attempt held, not pretty, held. Glass came from a stack of salvaged panes behind Harlan and Son, each priced by size and mercy. Mr. Harlan cut 2 for her while she watched, scoring with a wheel cutter tapping beneath the line, then snapping the glass with a sound so clean it made her flinch. "Glass likes confidence," he said. "I do not have much." Borrow some from the tool. The sash cords came next. 4 windows had broken ropes, the weights sunk uselessly in their pockets. Della opened the trim carefully, numbering each piece in pencil on the back so it could return to its place. Inside the pockets, she found dust, a dead beetle, 2 acorns, and iron counterweights shaped like long narrow loaves. The new cord was 1/4 inch cotton, plain and strong. She learned the figure-8 knot by failing it twice. The cord went over the pulley, down to the counterweight through its eye, around itself in a careful path that would not slip under load. She pulled, tested, retied, and tested again. When the first sash moved upward and stayed where she left it, the pleasure was so precise she laughed once aloud, then looked around as if the house might object to the sound. It did not. Window by window, February became less welcome indoors. The 3 empty openings held glass again. The 4 cracked panes were replaced or stabilized, except where a crack in the wavy original east window ran short and old near the corner. That one she left, sealing only the edge because a scar that had stopped moving did not need surgery. The work took days longer than expected. Putty needed skinning time. Paint had to wait. Cold slowed everything. Some mornings she worked in her coat, scarf, and Reverend Boyd's mittens with the fingertips folded back. Some afternoons sun came through the repaired glass and laid rectangles on the oiled floor, and the room changed so completely that she stood still just to witness it. The last window was one of the high backroom windows near the vats. She had put it off because the ladder position was awkward and the sash had swollen in its frame. Elias came once, looked at it, and said, "Stubborn." "Yes, sir." "Like people." Then he left without helping, which was his way of saying she could manage. Della worked the sash loose with a putty knife, patience and light taps from the heel of her hand. She removed the broken pane, cleaned the rabbit, brushed away dust, and bedded the new glass in a thin line of putty. Outside, the walnut branches moved against a flat white sky. Inside, the copper vats held the cold light along their rims. As she set the final glazier's point, a chickadee landed on the walnut branch outside the window. It was so near she could see the black cap, the white cheek, the tiny claws gripping bark. The bird tipped its head and looked in at her, not startled, not impressed. Its body was no bigger than a closed fist, yet it seemed entirely sufficient for winter. Della held still with the glazing tool in her hand. The chickadee gave one small call. Then it lifted away from the branch and crossed the yard toward the alders. Della drew the last line of putty in one steady pull. She did not touch it again. By evening, all 8 windows held against the wind. The dye house was still cold, it was still unfinished, but the drafts had become smaller, more particular, no longer roaming through the rooms as if they owned them. That night, with the lantern low and the stove ticking beside her, Della looked across the restored floor toward the mended glass and saw the old workroom gathered inside its walls again. The house had not saved her, not yet. It had only made a place where she could lie down without being asked to leave. 2 winters later, in December of 2024, the first finished blanket came off the drying rack before sunrise. The dye house was still cold in the corners, because brick remembers winter even when a stove has been faithful for hours. Frost held white along the outside of the east window, but inside, the pane stayed clear enough for Della to see the walnut branches drawn against the dark. The little iron stove ticked and settled, a kettle whispered on top of it. Beneath the back beam where skeins had once hung in another woman's time, a long wool blanket rested over the rack in slow folds. It was not bright. That pleased her. The colour had come from walnut hulls gathered after hard frost, sumac from the dry hill, and a small afterbath of iron so weak she had almost doubted it would matter, but it had mattered. The wool had taken on a deep brown with a living undertone, warmer in the folds, cooler along the edges, like river stones held under tea. In the first clean light of morning, the blanket looked almost plain. Then she lifted one corner and the colour moved. September tea. She stood there with both hands on the cloth and let the words arrive from a room long behind her. Mr. Harlan's mother had named a shawl that way. Mabel might have smiled at the precision of it. Esther would have written down the ratios and asked about the water. Della had written everything. Fibre weight, mordant, alum 15%, cream of tartar 6, walnut hulls gathered November 18th after 2 hard freezes, sumac cut from the dry rise beyond the creek, iron liquor 1/2%, 5 minutes, no more. Water carried from town until the well test came clean, then blended half and half because the well gave a darker hand to browns. Heat held below 160 degrees, no boil, never boil a colour you want to keep alive. The first finished blanket was not for sale. She folded it in thirds and laid it across the old counter beneath the east window, where morning light bent through the wavy glass and touched the wool without flattening it. Then she set Esther's notebook and Mabel's notebook beside it, not open, not displayed, just present. The restored interior had become modest and exact. The receiving room held one counter, one ledger desk repaired with salvaged pine, 2 straight-back chairs and a narrow shelf for finished skeins. The floor had darkened under oil and use, its old path still visible from door to counter. The windows held against snow. The original east pane remained cracked near one corner, sealed but not erased. In the back room, the copper vats had been cleaned but not polished into vanity. They held their green shadows at the rims, their dents, their memory of heat. The draining rack had been pegged tight again. The shelves had been braced. The jars in the cellar were catalogued, labelled, and left alone when they were unsafe. Nothing had been made grand. That was part of the repair. The brass key had sat on the mantel for almost a year before Della learned what it opened. She had found it in the oak box wedged under the third cellar step late one February morning, wrapped with a tintype photograph from 1903. The photograph showed a young woman standing in front of the dye house, 25 years old, straight-backed, clear-eyed, with Della's own face arranged in another century. On the back, in Esther's hand, was written, Lydia Ruth Barlow, daughter of William Asa Barlow, age 25, summer of 1903. The key had a bow shaped like a dyer's paddle, narrow at the throat and rounded at the end. Della had tried it in every lock she could find, door, desk, cabinet, tool chest, cellar hasp. None answered. Then, during the second winter, after a storm had broken a dead limb from the older walnut tree, she saw the brass plate. It had been hidden under bark grown around it for decades, set into the trunk on the side facing away from the road. Only the storm had exposed a corner. Della cleared moss gently with a wooden scraper, not metal, until the plate emerged. It was green with age, no larger than her palm, and at its centre was a keyhole almost swallowed by the tree's slow healing. She stood there in the snow for a long while before going inside. The brass key fit. It resisted once, then turned with a soft low click that seemed to come from inside the tree itself. A small panel opened, not wide, just enough to reveal a hollow lined with tin and cedar. Inside lay a folded 48-star flag wrapped in oilcloth, and beneath it, a note written in a hand Della now knew as Esther's but older, shakier. The note was dated November 11th, 1938, 20 years after the armistice. Della carried the flag and note inside with both hands. The flag was small, perhaps once used for a grave or mantle, its stars arranged in careful rows. Its red stripes faded toward rust. The note read, "For Thomas, who did not come home to the hills. I keep this here because the house remembers him better than the parlour ever did. He split kindling under this tree. He carved his initials where I told him not to. He carried wool sacks as if they weighed nothing and complained about every chore before doing it well. If this flag is found, let it not be sold. Let it be carried once, in daylight, to a place where his name may be spoken without hurry. A mother has few orders left after the earth has taken her son. This is mine. E. W. Barlow." Della folded the note along its old lines and sat with the flag in her lap until the stove burned low. On September 26th, the anniversary of the opening of the Meuse-Argonne offensive, she took the medal, the flag, and the note to Arms Cemetery in Shelburne Falls. Mr. Harlan drove because he said old medals deserved not to ride in a grocery bag. Doris came too, closing the cafe for 1 hour and taping a handwritten note to the door. Reverend Boyd stood beside them in his black coat, hat in both hands. They found no grave for Thomas there, because his body lay overseas, but there was a veteran's stone with names from the town and surrounding hills. His was among them, weather-softened but legible. Della placed the flag in its oilcloth at the base of the stone, only long enough for the name to have company. She cleaned the medal with a dry cloth, no polish, no shine forced onto old bronze. Reverend Boyd spoke 4 words, the same words he had once said in passing by her door. "Keep what is given." No one made more ceremony than that. The money in the tin box had not become a new life in the way a louder story might have demanded. Della spent 3 coins. 1 mercury dime paid for the first classified notice she placed at the cafe corkboard, because she wanted the first public word of the reopened dye house to come from old silver, not a bank card. 1 Walking Liberty $half paid Mr. Harlan for the final pane of salvaged glass, though he argued and lost. 1 wheat cent, dark and ordinary, was sealed into the underside of the repaired counter, not as superstition but as witness. Later, when winter was hard and medicine bills came due, she spent 2 more coins after sitting with the decision for 3 nights. A Franklin half, a silver quarter. Life itself had required them, and Esther's letter had already answered the shame before it could speak. The rest remained sealed, not hidden in fear, and not displayed in pride. Della cleaned the tin, wrapped the bundles again, added her own inventory and pencil, and placed it in a safer compartment she built behind the lowest shelf of the cellar. The wall looked ordinary when she finished. That mattered. The next one, whoever she might be, would need time more than spectacle. By the end of that second winter, the shop had quietly reopened. Not with a ribbon cutting, not with a newspaper feature. Della disliked the thought of strangers photographing the vats before they understood what they were looking at. Instead, there was an index card pinned to the corkboard inside Bridge Street Cafe. Barlow daughter wool dyeing. Natural plant colours, small batches, repair, re-dye, sample skeins. Orders by note only. Ask Doris for the blue pencil. That was all. The first order came from a woman in Buckland with 6 skeins of homespun that had belonged to her mother. The second came from a weaver in Coleraine who wanted no chemical brightness, only a brown that would not argue with winter light. The third came from a teacher who asked for small sample bundles for a class, and Della wrote back that children must see woad turn blue in air, or they would not believe patience had a colour. By spring, the mailing list had 43 names. Doris kept it in a recipe box behind the cafe counter. Mr. Harlan said a recipe box was no way to run a business. Doris said it had run pies for 30 years and could manage wool. Della wrote each address by hand, not because handwriting was efficient, but because names deserved to enter slowly. Elaine saw the dye house once before she died. Della brought her in late May when the air was warm enough and the road dry. Mr. Harlan borrowed a wheelchair from the church. Reverend Boyd drove. Doris sent egg salad sandwiches wrapped in wax paper and a jar of lemonade with mint. Elaine sat near the east window with the blanket over her knees and watched steam rise from the vat. Illness had made her face smaller, but not empty. Della showed her the notebooks, the old tools, the restored floor, the walnut tree. She did not show her all the money. Some knowledge would have been too heavy for a body already carrying its last season. Elaine touched the brown blanket and closed her eyes. "It looks like your grandmother's hands," she said. That was the last full sentence Della remembered clearly from her mother's mouth. There were others afterwards, small and broken by breath, but that one remained whole. In June, after the funeral, Della returned to the dye house and did not work for 6 days. She opened windows in the morning and shut them at night. She ate what Doris left. She walked to the marsh and watched the heron when it came. She let grief be slow enough to tell the truth. The house did not hurry her. In September, Caleb came back. He was taller than when he had first appeared, with a splitting maul and a Schwinn bicycle, saying his mother had told him to help because of something Della's grandfather had once done for their family. He had refused money then. He refused it still, though now he was old enough to refuse with more confidence and less embarrassment. This time he came carrying a wooden sign wrapped in a quilt. "I made it in shop class," he said, though the careful sanding and carved letters suggested more than classwork. Della cleared the counter. Caleb unwrapped it. The sign was white pine, hand-carved, the letters deep and clean, the edges left slightly irregular so they did not pretend to be machine-made. He had copied the old lettering from the weathered board above the door, but he had changed one thing. Barlow daughters. Wool scoring and dyeing. Natural colours kept slow. Della read the first line twice. "Plural," she said. Caleb looked at the floor. Doris said it should be plural. Doris says many things. She said dead women count. Della ran her fingers along the carved S at the end of daughters. The old sign had named one daughter, perhaps Lydia, perhaps every woman who had worked where records forgot them. This one made room for more. Mabel, who had read colours by weather. Esther, who had hidden time in paper and silver. Elaine, who had worked until her body could not. Lydia, whose face had crossed a century in a tintype. Ruth, Annabel, Marie, whose true name had not been kept but whose knowledge had entered the valley through walnut, sumac and careful hands. And Della too, though. She was still learning how to stand inside that kind of company. They hung the sign on a clear afternoon. Mr. Harlan brought proper screws and complained about Caleb's pilot holes. Elias, older and more bent now, sat on an upturned crate and directed without climbing. Doris brought coffee. Reverend Boyd held the ladder because he said his prayers worked better when accompanied by practical support. The yellow dog, grey around the muzzle, lay near the walnut roots and watched the proceedings with grave disinterest. When the sign was fixed above the door, the building looked neither new nor old. It looked named. That evening, after everyone left, Della began her own letter. She used pencil, as Esther had. Ink seemed too sure of itself. She sat at the ledger desk in the receiving room, with the east window cracked open and the smell of cooling wool in the air. The first sheet remained blank for almost an hour. She could hear the creak. She could hear the stove settling. She could hear, now and then, a car passing on the road beyond the walnuts. At last she wrote the only opening that felt honest. "My dear one, whoever you are." Then she stopped. The words were not hers alone, and that was why they were right. She wrote slowly after that, not to finish, not to explain everything, but to begin leaving a path. She wrote of the roof patch and where the sister rafter had been placed. She wrote which window held original glass and must not be replaced for convenience. She wrote that the well water darkened walnut and softened weld, and that the creek should be watched in warm rain. She wrote that Mr. Harlan's ledger had been paid, though kindness could not be settled in columns. She wrote Doris's name because recipes and mercy both needed witnesses. She did not write a grand lesson. She wrote useful things. Where the spare sash cord hung, which cellar jars should not be opened, how to test the chimney draught after a long damp week, which floorboard near the counter still complained in wet weather, how much alum for 1 pound of wool, how grief could ruin madder if the dyer let the pot boil. Near the end, she wrote about the money. Not the total first, that would make the wrong kind of reader hurry, she wrote instead. Use it slowly. Repair before improving. Eat before decorating. Keep enough for the next one. Then, after a pause, she added, "If you have arrived with nothing, sit down before you count. A number cannot hold you, a room can." The candle beside her was ordinary, bought from Harlan and Son, but its flame still leaned in the draught the way Lydia's old beeswax candle had leaned years before. Della watched it for a moment, then wrote one more line. This house was never empty. It was only waiting for careful hands. Outside snow began before midnight. It fell without drama, covering the ruts in the drive, the creek stones, the walnut roots, the place where the horseshoe remained half held by earth. It softened the roof patch until cedar and slate looked almost of one piece. It gathered along the new sign's carved letters, filling Barlow or Daughters with white. Inside, the wool-dyeing house held its heat. Not perfectly, old buildings never do. A draught still entered near the back threshold. The north wall still cooled first. The chimney asked to be watched in hard weather. The cellar kept its own temperature no matter what happened above. But the rooms were sound enough for work, and work was sound enough for living. Della folded her unfinished letter and placed it in the ledger desk. She would add to it year by year. Mistakes, repairs, recipes, names, small warnings, small mercies. The things a person learns only after staying. Then she took the first brown blanket from the counter and carried it into the back room. She spread it over the drying rack, though it was already dry, because she liked seeing it there beneath the beam where other cloth had hung before it. The colour deepened in the lamplight, walnut, sumac, iron, winter, hand hour. She stood beneath it and listened to snow touch the roof. No one came to ask her to leave. No landlord turned a key in the door. No clerk warned her away from liability. No deputy stood on the porch with wet boots. No fluorescent shelter light hummed above her while strangers guarded their bags in sleep. Those things had happened, they remained true, but they were no longer the only truth. The wool-dyeing house waits. It has always waited. And in the county clerk's office, in a shallow wooden drawer beside old receipts and a brass stamp rubbed dark by many hands, Mrs. Whitcomb had kept one thing longer than procedure required. A torn corner dollar bill from the $6 bid. She had written the date on a slip of paper and tucked it around the bill before filing the rest properly. Not as evidence, not as sentiment she would admit aloud, only as a reminder that once in a cold November, a girl with road salt on her shoes had placed her last money on the counter and bought a condemned house nobody else believed worth saving. Years later, when the clerk retired, she left the dollar in the drawer. The new clerk found it, read the note, and left it there too. Some records belong in books, some belong in walls, and some, if a town is wise enough, remain folded in quiet drawers, waiting for the next careful hand.